The Temptation of Clay, Part 1. Some men grow away from places, others grow into them. It is a curious and delicate matter. Before now a man has been thrown out by his own property, yet his successor made immediately at home there. Once let imagination dwell upon this psychology of places, and it will travel very far. Here lies a great mystery, entangled with the mystery of life itself, delicately baited too. Only the utterly obtuse, one thinks, can ignore the hint offered by nature, that there is this very definite relationship existing between places and human beings, and that the aggressive attitude is not always chiefly upon the side of the latter. So it is that there are spots of country, mere bits of scenery, a valley, plain, or riverbank, estate, or even garden, that undeniably bid a man stay, and welcome, or for no ascertainable reason reject him and make him anxious to leave. Campers looking for a night's resting place know this well, and so may owners of estates and houses, campers on a larger scale seeking to settle somewhere for the few years of a lifetime. Neither one nor other, however, one thinks, unless he be a swift-minded poet with vivid divination, gets quite to the root of the matter. Very suggestive are the mysterious processes by which such results are sometimes brought about, a certain pathos in them too. For the rejected owner is usually of that hard intellectual type that is utterly insensible to the fairy flails of beauty, and seeks therefore in vain through all his stores of logic for a reasonable cause and effect, whereas the accepted one, exquisitely adjusted though he may be to the seduction of the place that takes him in, yet is unable to tell in words what really happens, or to express a tithe of that sweet, marvelous explanation that lies concealed within his heart. The one denies it, the other makes wild poetic guesses, but neither really knows. Dick Elliott understood something of the 2 points of view, perhaps, because he experienced both acceptance and rejection, and this story of how a place first welcomed him, then violently tossed him out again, is as queer a case of such relationship as one may ever hear. But then, Dick Elliott combined in himself a measure of both types of mind. He was intellectual and knew that 2 and 2 make 4. But he was also mystical, and knew that they make 5 or nothing, or a million, that everything is one, and one is everything. Neither was perhaps very strong in him, because life had not provided the opportunity for one or other's exclusive development. But both existed side by side in his general mental composition, and they resulted in a level so delicately poised that the apparent balance yet had instability at its roots. Leaving England at 22 or 3, there were misunderstandings with his university, where in classics and philosophy he had promised well, with his step-parents who regarded him as well as lost, and in a sense that yet did not affect his honor with his country's law, he had since met life in difficult, rough places. He had lived. All manner of experiences had been his. He had known starvation in strange cities, and had more than once been close to death. Queer kinds of death. But also he had been close to earth, and the earth had wonderfully taught him. The results of this teaching, not recognized at the time, came out later to puzzle and amaze him. For years he dwelt in the wilderness with life reduced to its essentials, the big, crude, thundering facts of it, so that he had come to regard scholarship, once so valued as overrated, and action as the sole reality. The poetic, mystical side of him passed into temporary abeyance. Worldly achievement and ambition led him. This, however, was a mood of youth only, a reaction due to the resentment of his exile, and to the grievance he cherished against the academic conventions, so he deemed them, that had cut him off from his inheritance. At 30 or thereabouts he fell in love and married, a vigorous personality of a woman with red Indian in her blood, picked up in some wild escapade along the frontiers of Arizona and New Mexico, and within 6 months of marriage the death of an aunt had left him unexpected master of this little gem of an estate in the south of England where the following experience took place. This impulsive action of an aunt whom he had seen but once, due to her wish to spite the other claimants rather than to any pretended love of himself, resulted in a radical change of life. He came home, ignored by his relations, and ignoring them in turn. The former love of books revived, the imaginative point of view reasserted itself. He saw life from another angle. Action, after all, was but a part of it, another form of play. The mental life was the reality. He studied, meditated, wrote. Once more the deep poetic mystery of things lit all his thoughts with wonder. Corrected by the hard experiences of his early years, the philosopher and dreamer in him assumed the upper hand, though the speculative dreams he indulged were more sanely regulated than before. The imagination was now more finely tempered. To look at, he was sometimes obviously 45, yet at others could easily have passed for 30, a tall, lean figure of a man, spare as though the wilderness had taken that toll of him which no amount of subsequent easy living could efface. To see him was to think of men toiling in a hard, stern land, where all things had to be conquered and nothing yielded of itself, where, moreover, human life was cheap and of small account. He was alert, always in training, cheeks thin, neck sinewy, knees ready instantly to turn a horse by grip alone. The reins unnecessary so that both hands were free to fight. The eyes were keen and dark, mustache clipped very short and partly grizzled. Deep furrows marked the jaw and forehead, but the muscular hands were young, the fling of the shoulders young, the toss and set of the big head young as well. And he always dressed in riding breeches, with a strap about the waist instead of braces. You might see him hitch them up as he stepped back to leap the stream, or to take the pine knolls with a run downhill. Indeed, the imaginative side of him seemed almost incongruous, and that such a figure could conceal a mystical, tenderly poetic side not one man in 1,000 need have guessed. But in spite of these severer traits, the character, he felt, was tender enough upon its underside. It was merely that the control of the body and emotions acquired in the wilds had never been unlearned, and that no amount of softer living could let it be forgotten. About the rather grim and over-silent mouth, for instance, there were marks like the touches of a flower that sometimes made the sternness seem a clumsy mask. An intuitive woman or a child must have found him out at once. 2. After years spent as he had spent them among the conditions of primitive lands, Dick Elliot came back with his uncivilized wife to find that with the old established values of English county existence they had little or nothing in common. Their ostracism by the neighborhood has no place in this story, except to show how it threw them back intensely into the little property he had inherited. They lived there 12 years, isolated, childless, knowing that solitude in a crowd, which is yet never loneliness. The place, as they always called it, took them and welcomed to itself. The land, running to several hundred acres, was comparatively worthless, mere jumbled stretch of sand and pines and heathery hills, too remote from any building center to be easily sold, and of no avail for agricultural purposes, for which, since he had just enough to live on quietly, both were grateful. They could keep it lovely and unspoiled. All round it, however, was an opulent, overbuilt-upon country that they loathed, since they felt that its quality, once admitted, would cause the place to wither and die. The gross surfeit of prosperous houses, preserved woods, motoring hotels, and the rest would settle on its virgin face. Builders and businessmen would commercially appraise it, financiers undress it publicly so that it would know itself naked and ashamed. Deep down its soul would turn weakly and diseased, then disappear, and their own assuredly go with it. For both had loved the place at sight. She in particular loved it, with a kind of rude enthusiasm she forced, as it were, upon his gentler character. Its combination of qualities fascinated her. The old-world mellowness with the unkempt, untidy wildness. The way it kept alive that touch of the wilderness she had known from childhood, set in the midst of so much over-civilized country all about, gave her the feeling of having a little precious secret world entirely to herself. She forced this view with all the vigor of her primitive poetry upon her husband, till he accepted it as his own. It became his own, only she realized it more vitally than he did. The contrast laid a spell upon her, and she would not hear of going away. They lived there in this miniature world until they knew it with such close intimacy that it became identified with their very selves. She made him see it through her eyes, so that the place was haunted, saturated, invested with their moods of worship, love, and wonder. It became a little mystery world that their feelings had turned living. Thus, when, after 12 years' happiness together, she died there, he stayed on, sole guardian, as it were, of all she had loved so dearly. Too vital a man to permit the slightest morbid growth which comes from brooding, he yet lived among fond memories, aware of her presence in every nook and glade, in every tree, her voice in the tinkle of the stream, new values everywhere. Each ridge and valley, made familiar by her step and perfume, strengthened recollection, and more than ever before the place seemed interwoven with herself and him, subtle expression of vanished joys. The past stayed on in it. It did not move away, it remained the present. Her death had doubly consecrated the little estate, making it, so to speak, a sacrament of dear communion. The only change, it seemed, was that he identified it with her being more than with himself or with the two of them. He guarded it unspoilt and sweet, because of her who held it once so dear, as another man might have kept a flower she had touched, a picture, or a dress that she had worn. Now it was doubly safe from the damage she had feared. Commercial spoliation. "Keep the place as it is, Dick," she had so often said with a vehemence that belonged to her vigorous type. "I'd hate to see it dirtied." For her, the civilized country round had always been dirty, and he did so, almost with the feeling that he was keeping her person clean at the same time. For what a man thinks about is real, and he had come to regard the place and herself as one. Throwing himself into definite work to occupy his mind, he kept it as the apple of his eye, living in solitude, and cared for only by a motherly old housekeeper, years ago his mother's maid, whose services he had by fortunate chance secured. He spent his leisure time in writing, studies of obscure periods and forgotten history that, when published, merely added to the clutter of the world's huge mental lumber room, to judge by the reviews. Once he made a journey to his haunts of youth, their youth, in Arizona, but only to return dissatisfied with added pain. He settled down finally then, throwing himself with commendable energy into his studies, till the hurrying years brought him thus to 45. Rarely he went to London and pored over musty volumes in the British Museum reading room, but after a day or two would hear the murmur of the mill wheel singing round that portentous dreary dome, and back he would come again post-haste. And perhaps he chose his line of study rather than more imaginative work, because it reasonably absorbed him, while yet it stole no single emotion from his past with her, nor trespassed upon the walking of one dear faint ghost. 3. And it was upon this gentle, solitary household that suddenly Manya Petrovsky descended with her presence of wonder and of magic. Out of a clear blue sky she dropped upon him and made herself deliciously at home. Only daughter of his widowed sister, married to a Russian, she was 14 at the time of her mother's death, and the duty seemed forced upon him with a conviction that admitted of no denial. He had never seen the child in his life, for she was born in the year that he returned to England, family relations simply non-existent. But he had heard of her, partly from Mrs. Couve, his housekeeper, and partly from tentative letters his sister wrote from time to time, aiming at reconciliation. He only knew that she was backward to the verge of being stupid, that she loved nature and life out of doors, and that she shared with her strange father a certain sulking moodiness that seemed to have been so strong in his own half-civilized Slav temperament. He also remembered that her mother, a curious mixture of Puritanism and weakly dread of living, had brought her up strictly in the manufacturing city of the Midlands, where they dwelt wealthily, surrounded by an atmosphere of artificiality that he deemed almost criminal. For his sister, fostering old-fashioned religious tendencies, believed that a visible Satan haunted the frontiers of her narrow orthodoxy, and would devour Manya as soon as look at her once she strayed outside. She too had claimed, he remembered, to love nature, though her love of it consisted solely in looking cleverly out of windows at passing scenery she need never bother herself to reach. Her husband's violent tempers she had likewise ascribed to his possession by a devil, if not by her own personal devil himself. And when this letter, written on her deathbed, came begging him as the only possible relative to take charge of the child, he accepted it, as his character was, unflinchingly, yet with the greatest possible reluctance. Significant, too, of his character was the detail that, out of many others, surely far more important first haunted him. She'll love nature, by which he meant the place, in the way her mother did, artificially. We shan't get on a bit. Thus instinctively betraying what lay nearest to his heart. Nonetheless, he accepted the position without hesitation. There was no money. His sister's property was found to be mortgaged several times above its realizable value, and the child would come to him without a penny. He went headlong at the problem, as at so many other duties that had faced him. Puzzling, awkward duties, with a kind of blundering delicacy native to his blood. "Got to be done. No good dreaming about it," he said to himself within a few hours of receiving the letter. And when, a little later, the telegram came announcing his sister's death, he added shortly with a grim expression, "Here goes, then." In this plucky, yet not really impulsive decisiveness, the layer of character acquired in Arizona asserted itself. Action ousted dreaming. And in due course the preparations for the girl's reception were concluded. She would make the journey south alone, and Mrs. Couve would meet her. Moreover, evidence to himself at least of true welcome, Manya should have the bedroom which had been for years unoccupied, his wife's. For all that, he dreaded her arrival unspeakably. "She'll be bored here. She'll dislike the place, perhaps hate it, and I shall dislike her too." 4. Eliot ruled his little household well, because he ruled himself. No one, from the tri-weekly gardener to the rough half-breed Westerner who managed the modest stable, felt the least desire to trifle with him. Even Mrs. Couve, in the brief morning visits to his study, did not care about asking him to repeat some sentence that she had not quite caught or understood. Yet, in a sense, as with all such men, it was the woman who really managed him. Mrs. Couve, big motherly spinster, divined the child beneath the grim exterior, and simply played with him. She it was who really ran the household, relieving him of all domestic worries, and she it was, had he fallen ill, which even for a day he never did, who would have nursed him into health again with such tactfully concealed devotion that, while loving the nursing, he would never have guessed the devotion. So it was largely upon Mrs. Couve that he secretly relied to welcome, manage, and look after his little orphaned niece, while of course pretending that he did it all himself.
"She'll want a companion, sir, of sorts, if I may make so bold. Someone to play with,"
she told him when he had mentioned that later, of course, he would provide a governess or something when he had first sized up the child. He looked hard at her for a moment. He realized her meaning, that the hostile neighborhood could be relied on to supply nothing of that kind. "Oh, of course," he said, as though he had thought of it himself.
"She'll love the pony, sir, if she ain't one of the booky sort, which I seem to remember she ain't,"
added Mrs. Couve, looking as usual as though just about to burst into tears, for her motherly face wore a lachrymose expression that was utterly deceptive. Her contempt for books, too, and writing folk was never quite successfully concealed. In silence he watched the old woman wipe her moist hands upon a black apron, and the perplexities of his new duties grew visibly before his eyes. She had little notion that secretly her master stood a little in awe of her superior domestic knowledge. "The pony in the woods," he suggested briefly.
"A puppy or a kitten, sir, would help a bit, for indoors, if I may make so bold,"
the housekeeper ventured, with a passing gulp at her own audacity.
"And out of doors, sir, as you say, maybe she'll be happy enough. Her poor mother taught."
The long breath she had taken for this sentence she meant to use to the last gasp, if possible, but her master cut her short. "Miss Manya arrives at 6, he said, turning to his books and papers. "The dog cart with you in it to meet her, please." The please was added because he knew her vivid dislike of being too high from the ground, while judging correctly that the pleasure would more than compensate for her this risk of elevation. It was also intended to convey that he appreciated her help, but deplored her wordiness. Laconic even to surliness himself, he disliked long phrases. It was a perpetual wonder to him why even lazy people who detested effort would always use a dozen words where two were more effective. So Mrs. Couve, accustomed to his ways, departed, with a curtsy that more than anything else resembled a sudden collapse of the knees beneath more than they could carry comfortably.
"Thank you, sir. I'll see to it all right,"
she said, obedient to his glance, beginning the sentence in the room but finishing it in the passage. She looked as though she would weep hopelessly once outside, whereas really she felt beaming pleasure. The compliment of being sent to meet Miss Manya made her forget her dread of the elevated swaying dog-cart, as also of the silent half-breed groom who drove it. Full of importance, she went off to make preparations. And later, when Mrs. Couve was on her way to the station 5 miles off, dangerously perched, as it seemed to her, in mid-air, He made his way out slowly into the woods, a vague feeling in him that there was something he must say goodbye to. The place, henceforth, with Manya in it, would be not quite the same. What change would come he could not say, but something of the secrecy, the long-loved tender privacy and wonder would depart. Another would share it with him, a trespasser, in a sense an outsider. And as he roamed the little pine-grown vales, the mossy coverts, and the knee-high bracken, there stole into him this queer sensation that it all was part of a living something that constituted almost a distinct entity. His wife inspired it, but also the place had a personality of its own, apart from the qualities he had read into it. He realized for the first time that it too might take an attitude towards the new arrival. Everywhere it seemed there was an air of expectant readiness. It was aware it might possibly resent it. And for moments here and there as he wandered rose other ideas in him as well, brought for the first time into existence by the thought of the new arrival. This element, like a sudden shaft of sunlight on a landscape, discovered to him a new aspect of the mental picture. It was vague, yet perplexed him not a little. And it was this, that the thing he loved in all this little property, thinking it always as his own, was in reality what she had loved in it, the thing that she had made him see through the lens of her own more wild poetic vision. What he was now saying goodbye to, the thing that the expected intruder might change or even oust, was after all but a phantom memory, the aspect she had built into it. This curious, painful doubt assailed him for the first time. Was his love and worship of the place really an individual possession of his own, or had it been all these years but her interpretation of it that he enjoyed vicariously? The thought of Manya's presence here etched this possibility in sharp relief. Unwelcome, and instantly dismissed, the thought yet obtruded itself, that his feelings had not been quite genuine, quite sincere, and that it was her memory, her so vital vision of the place he loved rather than the place itself at first hand. For the first idea that another was on the way to share it stirred the unconscious query. What precisely was it she would share? And behind it came a still more subtle questioning that he put away almost before it was clearly born. Was he really quite content with this unambitious guardianship of the dream estate? And was the grievance of his exile so completely dead that he would, under all possible conditions, keep its loveliness inviolate and free from spoliation? The coming of the child, with the new duties involved and the probable later claims upon his meager purse, introduced a worldly element that for so long had slept in him. He wondered. The ghosts all walked. But beside them walked other ghosts as well, and this new strange pain of uncertainty came with them. Sinister, though exceedingly faint suggestion that he had been worshipping a phantom fastened into his heart by a mind more vigorous than his own. Ambition, action, practical achievement stirred a little in their sleep. And on his way back he picked some bits of heather and bracken, a few larch twigs with little cones upon them and several sprays of pine. These he carried into the house and up into the child's bedroom, where he stuck them about in pots and vases. The flowers Mrs. Coof had arranged he tossed away. For flowers in a room, or in a house at all, he never liked. They looked unnatural, artificial. Flowers and food together on a table seemed to him as dreadful as the sickly-smelling wreaths people loved to put on coffins. But leaves were different, and earth was best of all. In his own room he had 2 wide, deep boxes of plain earth, watered daily, renewed from time to time, and more sweetly scented than any flowers in the world. Opening the windows to let in all the sun and air there was, he glanced round him with critical approval. To most the room must have seemed bare enough, yet he had put extra chairs and tables in it, a sofa too, because he thought the child would like them. Personally, he preferred space about him. His own quarters looked positively unfurnished. Rooms were cramped enough as it was, and useless upholstery gave him a feeling of oppression. He still clung to essentials, and an empty room like earth and sky was fine and dignified. But Manya, he well knew, might feel differently, and he sought to anticipate her wishes as best he might. For Manya came from a big house where the idea was to conceal every inch of empty space with something valuable and useless, and her playground had been gardens smothered among formal flower beds, triangles, crescents, circles, anything that parodied nature, paths cut cleanly to neat patterns, and plants that acknowledged their shame by growing all exactly alike without a trace of individuality. He moved to the open window, gazing out across the stretch of hill and heathery valley, thick with stately pines. The wind sighed softly past his ears. He heard the murmur of the droning mill wheel, the drum and tinkle of falling water mingling with it, and the years that had passed since last he stood and looked forth from this window came up close and peered across his shoulder. The past rose silently beside him and looked out too. He saw it all through other eyes that once had so large a share in fashioning it. Again came this singular impression, that while he waited, the whole place waited too. It knew that she was coming. Another pair of feet would run upon its face and surface. Another voice wake all its own little echoes. Another mind seek to read its secret and share the mystery of its being. Manya doesn't like it, struck with real pain across his heart. But the thought did not complete itself. Only into the strong face came a momentary expression of helplessness that sat strangely there. Whether the child would like himself or not seemed a consideration of quite minor importance. A sound of wheels upon the gravel at the front of the house disturbed his deep reflections, and, shutting the door carefully behind him, he gave one last look round to see that all was right, and then went downstairs to meet her. The sigh that floated through his mind was not allowed to reach the lips, but another expression came up into his face. His lips became compressed, and resolution passed into his eyes. It was the look, and how he would have laughed, perhaps, could he have divined it. The look of set determination that years ago he wore when in some lonely encampment among the Badlands something of danger was reported near. With a sinking heart he went downstairs to meet his duty. But in the hall, scattering his formal phrases to the winds, a boyish figure, yet with loose flying hair, ran up against him, then stepped sharply back. There was a moment's pitiless examination.
"Uncle Dick,"
he heard cried softly.
"Is that what you're like? But how wonderful!"
And he was aware that a pair of penetrating eyes set wide apart in a grave but eager face were mercilessly taking him in. It was he who was being sized up. No redskin ever made a more rapid and thorough examination, nor probably a more accurate one.
"Oh, I never thought you would look so kind and splendid."
"Me?" he gasped, forgetting every single thing he had planned to say in front of this swift-moving creature who attacked him. She came close up to him, her voice breathless still, but, if possible, softer, eyes shining like two little lamps.
"I expected, from what Mother said, you'd be just Uncle Richard, and instead it's only Uncle Dick."
Here was unaffected sincerity indeed. He had dreaded, he hardly knew why, some simpering sentence of formality, or even tears at being lonely in a strange house, and in place of either came this sort of cowboy verdict, straight as a blow from the shoulder. It took his breath away. In his heart something turned very soft and yearning, and yet he winced. "Nice drive?" he heard his gruff voice asking. For the life of him he could think of nothing else to say, and the answer came with a little peal of breathless laughter, increasing his amazement and confusion.
"I drove all the way. I made the blackie let me, and the motherly person held on behind like a bolster. It was glorious."
At the same moment 2 strong, quick arms, thin as a lariat, were round his neck, and he was being kissed, once only, though it felt all over his face. She stood on tiptoe to reach him, pulling his head down towards her lips.
"How are you, Uncle, please?"
"Thanks, Manya," he said shortly, straightening up in an effort to keep his balance. "All right, glad you are too. Mrs. Coove, your motherly person who held on like a bolster, will take you upstairs and wash you. Then food, soon as you like." He had not indulged in such a long sentence for years. It increased his bewilderment to hear it. Something ill-regulated had broken loose. Mrs. Coove, who had watched the scene from the background and doubtless heard the flattering description of herself, moved forward with a mountainous air of possession. Her face, as usual, seemed to threaten years, but there was a gleam in her eyes which could only come from the joy of absolute approval. With a movement of her arm that seemed to gather the child in, she went laboriously upstairs. The back of her alone proved to any seeing eye that she had already passed willingly into the state of abject slavery that all instinctive mothers love.
"We shan't be barely 5 minutes, sir,"
she called respectfully when halfway up, and the way she glanced down upon her grim master, who stood still with feet wide apart watching them, spoke further her opinion. and her joy at it, that he too was caught within her toils.
"She'll manage you, sir, if I make so bold,"
was certainly the thought her words did not express. They vanished round the corner, the heavy tread and the light pattering step, and he still stood on there, waiting in the hall. A mist rose just before his eyes he did not see quite clearly. In his heart a surge of strong deep feeling struggled upwards, but was instantly suppressed. Manya had said another thing that moved him far more than her childish appreciation of himself, something that stirred him to the depths most strangely. For when he asked her how she enjoyed the drive, the girl had replied with undeniable sincerity, looking straight into his eyes,
"The last bit was like a fairy tale. Uncle, how awfully this place must love you."
She did not say how you must love the place, and she loathed the dirty country all about. Then the first rush of excitement over, a sort of shyness, curiously becoming, had settled down all over her like a cloud. It settled down upon himself as well, but she had said the perfect thing, and his doubts all vanished. It was, yes, surely, the place she loved. And yet, when all was over, there passed through him an unpleasant afterthought, as though Manya had applied a test by which already something in himself was found gravely wanting. 5. With its sharp pine-grown declivities, its tumbling streams, stretches of open heather, and its miniature forests of bracken, the dream estate was like a Lilliputian Scotland, compressed into a few hundred acres. All was in exquisite proportion. The old house of rough gray stone, set in one corner, looked out upon a wild, untidy garden that melted unobserved into woods of mystery beyond, and farther off rose sharp against the sky a series of peaked knolls and ridges that in certain lights looked like big hills many miles away. There were diminutive fairy valleys you could cross in 20 minutes, and several rivulets wandering from the moorlands higher up formed the single stream that once had worked the mill. But the mill, standing a stone's throw from the study window so that he heard the water singing and gurgling almost among his bookshelves, had for a century ground nothing more substantial than sunshine, air, and shadow. For the gold dust of the stars is too fine for grinding, but it ground as well the dreams of the lonely occupant of the gray-toned house, and he let it stand there, falling gradually into complete decay, because beneath those crumbling wooden walls, he remembered it as of yesterday, the sudden stroke had come that in a moment, dropping as it seemed out of eternity, had robbed him of his chief possession, fashioner of the greatest dream of all. The splash and murmur of the water, the drone of the creaking wheel in flood time, the white weed that gathered thickly over the pond formed by the ancient dam, and the red-brown tint of walls and rotting roof, all were like the color of the water's singing, the color of her memory, and the color of his thinking, too, made sweetly visible. Indeed, despite his best control, she still lurked everywhere, so that he could not recall a single experience of the past years without at the same time some vivid aspect of the scenery as she saw it, rising up clearly to accompany it. In every corner stood the ghost of a still recoverable mood. Here he had suffered, fought, and prayed. Here he had loved and hated. Here he had lost and found. All the kaleidoscope aspects of growing older, of hopes and fears and disappointments, were visualized for him in terms of the place where he had met and dealt with them for his soul's good or ill. But behind them always stood that figure in chief. It was she who directed the ghostly band, and she it was who coaxed the romantic scenery thus into the support of all his personal moods, and continued to do so with even greater power after she was gone. His respect for the place seemed, therefore, involved with his respect for himself and her. That tumbling stream had an inalienable right of way. That mill of golden brown claimed ancient lights as truly as any mental place of thoughts within his mind, and the little dips and rises in the woods were as sacred, so he had always felt, as were those twists and turns of character that he called his views of life and his beliefs. This blend of himself with the place and her had been very carefully reared. The notion that its foundations were not impregnable forever was a most disturbing one. That the mere arrival of an intruder could shake it, possibly shatter it, touched sacrilege. And for long he suppressed the outrageous notion so successfully that he almost entirely forgot about it. This strip of vivid land whereon he dwelt acquired, moreover, a heightened charm from the character of the odious land surrounding it. For on all sides was that type of country best described as overfed and overlived upon. The scenery was choked and smothered unto death. It breathed, if at all, the breath of a fading life pumped through it artificially and with labor. Heavily beneath the skies it lay, acres of inert soil. There were indeed people who admired it, calling it typical of something or other in the south of England. But for him these people, like the land itself, were bourgeois, dull, insipid, and phlegmatic as the back of a sheep. Like rooms in a big club, it was overfurnished with too solid upholstery, thick fat hedges, formal oak woods, lifeless copses stuck upon slopes from which successful crops had sucked long ago the last vestiges of spontaneous life, and spotted with self-satisfied modern cottages, improved beyond redemption, that made him think with laughter of some scattered group of city aldermen. "They're pompous city magnates," he used to tell his wife, "strayed from the safety of Cornhill, and a little frightened by the wind and rain." Everywhere amid bushy trees that looked so pampered they were almost sham stood country houses, whole crops of them, dozing after heavy meals among gardens of sleek tulip and geraniums. They plastered themselves with the atmosphere of small crystal palaces upon every available opening, comfortably settled down and waited with every conceivable modern appliance, and in parks all cut to measure like children's wooden toys. They stood there, heavy and respectable, living close to the ground. And in them, almost without exception, dwelt successful businessmen who owned a country seat. From his uncivilized wild country point of view, they epitomized the soul of the entire scenery about them, something gross and sluggish that involved stagnation. They brooded with an air of vulgar luxury that was too stupid even to be active. Here resided, in a word, the wealthy. When he walked or drove through the 5 miles of opulent ugliness that lay between Mill House and the station, it seemed like crossing an inert stretch of adipose tissue, then lighting suddenly upon a pulsating nerve center. To step back into the fresh and hungry beauty of his Pine Valley, with its tumbling waters and its fragrance of wild loveliness, was an experience he never ceased to take delight in. The air at once turned keen. The trees gave out sharp perfumes. Waters rustled, foliage sang. Oh, here was life, activity, and movement. Vital currents flowed through and over it. The gray house among the fir trees, beckoning to the mill beyond, was a place where things might happen and pass swiftly. Here was no stagnation possible. Thrills of beauty, denied by that grosser landscape, returned electrically upon the heart. With every breath he drew in wonder and enchantment. In all this, for some years now, he had enjoyed alone. Rather than diminishing with his middle age, the spell had increased. Then came this sudden question of another's intrusion upon his dream estate, and he had dreaded painful alteration. The presence of another, most likely stupid and certainly unsympathetic, must cause a desolating change. Alteration there was bound to be, or at the best a readjustment of values that would steal away the wild and accustomed flavor. He had dreaded the child's arrival unspeakably. It had turned him abruptly timid, and this timidity betrayed the sweetness of the treasure that he guarded, for it came close to fear, the fear men know when they realize an attack they cannot, by any means within their power, hope to defeat. And alteration, as he apprehended, came, yet not the alteration he had dreaded. Manya's arrival had been a surprise that was pure joy. Its wonder almost woke suspicion, and the surprise he found grew into a series of surprises that at first took his breath away. The alchemy that her little shining presence brought persisted, grew from day to day, till it operated with such augmenting power that it changed himself as well. No stranger fairy tale was ever written. 6. Next day he put his work aside and devoted himself wholeheartedly to the lonely child. It was not only duty now. She had stirred his love and pity from the first. They would get on together, unconsciously by saying the very thing to win him. Uncle, how the place must love you. She had struck the fundamental tone that made the three of them in harmony, and set the whole place singing. The sense of an intruding trespasser had vanished. The place accepted her. It was only later that he realized this completely and in detail, though on looking back he saw clearly that the verdict had been given instantly, for no revision changed it.
"I'm all right here with Uncle,"
was the child's quick intuition, meeting his own halfway.
We three are all right here together.
For she leaped upon his beloved dream estate and made it seem twice as wild and living as before. She delighted in its loneliness and mystery. She clapped her hands and laughed, pointed and asked questions, made her eyes round with wonder, and, in a word, put her own feelings from the start into each nook and corner where he took her. There was no shyness, no confusion. She made herself at home with a little air of possession that, instead of irritating as it might have done, was utterly enchanting. It was like the chorus of approval that increased a man's admiration for the woman he has chosen. She brought her own interpretations, too, yet without destroying his own. They even differed from his own, yet only by showing him points and aspects he had not realized. The child saw things most oddly from another point of view. From the very first she began to say astonishing things. They piqued and puzzled him to the end. These things, she said. He felt they unraveled something. In his own mind, the personality of the place and the memory of his wife had become confused and jumbled, as it were. Manya's remarks and questions disentangled something. Her child's divination cleared his perceptions with a singular directness. She had strong in her that divine curiosity of children, which is as far removed from mere inquisitiveness as gold dust from a vulgar finished ornament. Wonder in her was vital and insatiable, and some of these questions that he could not answer stirred in him, even on that first day of acquaintance, almost the sense of respect. Morning and afternoon they spent together in visiting every corner of the woods and valleys. No inch was left without inspection. They followed the stream from the moorlands to the mill, plunged through the bracken, leaped the high tufts of heather, and scrambled together down the precipitous sand pits. She did not jump as well as he did, but showed equal recklessness, and the depths of shadowy pinewood made her hushed and silent like himself. In her childish way she felt the wild charm of it all deeply. Not once did she cry, "How lovely," or "How wonderful," but showed her happiness and pleasure by what she did. "Better than yesterday, eh?" he suggested once, to see what she would answer, yet sure it would be right. She darted to his side.
"That was all stuffed,"
she said laconically as himself, and making a wry face, and then she added with a grave expression, half anxious and half solemn,
"Fancy if that got in. Oh, Uncle."
"Couldn't," he comforted himself and her, delighted secretly. But it was on their way home to tea in the dusk, feeling as if they had known one another all their lives, so quickly had friendship been cemented, that she said her first genuinely strange thing. For a long time she had been silent by his side, apparently tired, when suddenly out popped this little criticism that showed her mind was actively working all the time.
"Uncle, you have been busy, keeping it so safe. I suppose you did most of it at night."
He started. His own thoughts had been traveling in several directions at once. "I don't walk in my sleep," he laughed.
"I mean when the stars are shining,"
she said. She felt it as delicately as that then. She felt the dream quality in it.
"I mean, it loves you best when the sun is set, and it comes out of its hole,"
she added, as he said nothing. "Manya, it loves you too, already," he said gently. Then came the astonishing thing. The voice was curious. The words seemed to come from a long way off, taking time to reach him. They took time to reach her, too, as though another had first whispered them. It almost seemed as though she listened while she said them. A sense of the uncanny touched him here in the shadowy dark wood.
"It's a woman, you see, really, and that's why you're so fond of it. That's why it likes me, too, and why I can play with it."
The amazing judgment gave him pause at once, for he felt no child ought to know or say such things. It savored of precociousness, even of morbidity, both of which his soul loathed. But reflection brought clearer judgment. The sentence revealed something he had already been very quick to divine, namely that while the ordinary mind in her was undeveloped, backward, almost stunted by her bringing up, another part of her was vividly aware. And this other part was taught of nature. It was the fairy thing that children had the right to know. She stood close to the earth. Landscape and scenery brought her vivid impressions that fairy tales rather stupidly translate into princes and princesses, ogres, giants, dragons. Manya, having been denied the fairy books, personified these impressions after her own fashion. What was it, after all, but the primitive instinct of early races that turned the moods of nature into beings, called them gods, or the instinct of a later day that personified the supreme calling it God? He himself had felt, in very imaginative moments, that bits of scenery, as with trees and even the heavenly bodies, could actually express such differences of temperament, seem positive or negative, almost male or female, and perhaps in her original, child's fashion, she felt it too. Then Manya interrupted his reflections with a further observation that scattered his philosophizing like an explosion. Something, as he heard it, came up close and brushed him. It made him start.
In some places, you see, Uncle, I feel shy all over. But here I could run about naked. I could undress.
He burst out laughing. Instinctively, he felt this was the best thing he could do. A sympathetic answer might have meant too much, yet silence would have made her feel foolish. His laughter turned the idea in her little mind all wholesome and natural. "Play here to your heart's content, for there's no one to disturb you," he cried. "And when I'm too busy," he added, thinking it a happy inspiration, "Mrs. Coove can—"
"Oh," she interrupted like a flash, "but she's too bulgy. She could never jump like you, for one thing."
"True."
"Or play hide and seek. She couldn't fit in anywhere. She'd never be able to hide, you see."
And so they reached the house, like two friends who had found suddenly a new delight in life, and sat down to an enormous tea with jam, buttered muffins, and a stodgy, indigestible cake straight from the oven. His tea hitherto had consisted of 1 cup and 2 pieces of thin bread and butter, but the appetite of 25 had come back again. A new joy of life had come back with it. After so many years of brooding, dreaming, solitary working, he had grown over-solemn, the sense of fun and humor atrophying. He had erected barriers between himself and all his kind, hedged himself in too much. The arrival of this child brought new impetus into the enclosure. Without destroying what imagination had prized so long, she shifted the old values into slightly different keys. Already he caught his thoughts running forward to construct her future, what she might become, how he might help her to develop spiritually and materially. Yes, materially as well. His thoughts had hitherto run chiefly backwards. This need not, indeed could not, involve being unfaithful to the past, but it did mean looking ahead instead of always looking back. It was more wholesome. Yet what dawned upon him, rather what chiefly struck him out of his singular observations perhaps was this: not only that the place had wholeheartedly accepted her, but that she had instantly established some definite relation with it that was different to his own. It was even deeper, truer, more vital than his own, for it was somehow more natural. It had been discovered, though already there, and it was not, like his own, built up by imaginative emotion. Hence came his notion that she disentangled something. Hence the respect he felt for her from the start. Hence, too, the original, surprising things she sometimes said. 7. For several days he watched and studied her while she turned the place into a private playground of her own with the air of sweet possession that had charmed him from the first. Backward and undeveloped she undeniably was, but in view of her stupid artificial bringing up, he understood this easily. Of books and facts, of knowledge taught in school, she was shockingly ignorant. The wrong part of her had been forced at the wrong time. The play side had been denied development, and while gathering force underground, her little brain had learned by heart, but without real comprehension, things that belonged properly to a later stage. For if ever there was one, here was an elemental being, free of the earth, native of open places, called to the wisdom of the woods. It all had been suppressed in her. She now broke out in loose, bewildered, and a little rampant, wild rather, and overjoyful. She reveled like an animal in newfound freedom. In time she sobered. He led her wisely, yet often she went too fast for him to follow and slipped beyond his understanding altogether. For there were gaps in her nature, unfilled openings in her mind, loopholes through which she seemed to escape too easily, perhaps too completely, into her playground, certainly too rapidly for him to catch her up. It was then she said these things that so astonished him, making him feel she was somehow an eldritch soul that saw things, nature especially, from a point of view he had never reached. Her sight of everything was original. A bird's-eye view he could understand. Most primitive folk possessed it, and in his wife it had been vividly illuminating. But Manya had not got this bird's-eye view, the sweeping vision that takes in everything at a single glance from above. Her angle was another one, peculiar to herself. Laughing, he thought of it rather as seeing everything from below, a fish's point of view. Brightness described her best. Eyes, skin, teeth, and lips all shone, yet her manner was subdued, not effervescent, and in it this evidence of depth, a depth he could not always plumb. It was a nature that sparkled, but the sparkle was suppressed, and he loved the sparkle, while loving even more its suppression. It gathered till the point of flame was reached, and it was the possible outrushing of this potential flame that won his deference, and sometimes stirred his awe. His dread had been considerable, anticipation keen, and the relief was in proportion. Here was a child he could both respect and love, and the sense of responsibility for the little being entrusted to his charge grew very strong indeed. In due course he supplied a governess, Fräulein Bielke. She came from the neighboring town with her broad, flat German face, framed in flaxen hair that was glossy but not oiled, and smoothed down close to the skull across a shining parting. Mechanically devout, rather fussy, literal in mind, exceedingly worthy and conscientious, her formula was, "You think that would be wise, then I'd try it." And the trying, which the tone suggested would be delicate, was applied with a blundering directness that defeated its own end. Her method was thumping rather than insinuating, and her notion of delicacy was to state her meaning heavily, add to it,
"Try to believe that I know best, dear child,"
and then conscientiously enforce it. Manya she understood as little as an okapi, but she was kind, affectionate, and patient. And though Eliot always meant to change her, he never did, for the getting of a suitable governess was more than he and Mrs. Couve could really manage.
"Der lieb Gott weiß alles,"
was the phrase with which she ended all their interviews, and if Manya's obedience showed a slight contempt, it was a contempt he did not think it wise entirely to check. For he himself could never scold her. It was impossible. It felt as though he stepped upon a baby. Their relations were those of equals almost, each looking up to the other with respect and wonder. Her schoolroom life became a thing apart, so did the hours in his study. Her walks with the governess and his journeys to the British Museum were mere extensions of the schoolroom and the study. It was when they went out together, roaming about the place at will, exploring, playing, building fires and the rest, that their true enjoyment came. Enjoyment all the keener because each stuck valiantly to duty first. Her face, though not exactly pretty, had the charm of some wild intelligence he had never seen before. The nose, slightly tilted, wore a tiny platform at its tip. The mouth was firm, lips exquisitely cut, but it was in the dark shining eyes that the expression of the soul ran into focus, though at times she knew long periods of silence that seemed almost sullen, when her eyes turned dead and coaly and she seemed almost gone away from behind them. One day she was old as himself, another a mere baby. Something was always escaping the leash and slipping off, then coming back with a rush of some astonishing sentence it had gone to fetch. Her physical appearance sometimes was elusive too, now tall, now short, her little body protean as her soul. Like running water, she was all over the house, not laughing much, not exactly gay or cheerful either, but somehow charged to the brim with a mysterious spirit of play. Grave, earnest play, yet airy with a consummate mischief sometimes that was the despair of Fräulein Bielke, who wore an expression then as though, after all, there were things God did not know. Yes, like running water through the rooms and corridors and tumbling down the stairs behind a kitten or round the skirts of bulgy Mother Couve. Swift and gentle always, yet with force enough to hurt you if you got in her way. Almost a sting or slap. Soft and very girlish to look at, she was really hard as a boy, flexible too as a willow branch, and with a rod of steel laced somewhere invisibly through her tenderness, unsuspected till occasionally, rarely betrayed its presence. It shifted its position too. One never knew where that firmness which is character would crop out and refuse to bend. For then the childishness would vanish. She became imperious as a little natural queen. The half-breed groom had a taste of this latter quality more than once, and afterwards worshipped the ground she walked on. To see them together, she in her dark gray riding habit holding a little whip, and he with his sinister wild face and half-malignant manners, called up some picture of a child and a savage animal she had tamed. But the thing Manya chiefly brought into his garden, and so also into the garden of his thoughts, was this new element of play. She brought with her not only the child's make-believe, but the child's conviction, earnestness, and sense of reality.
"Tell me one thing,"
she had a way of saying, short preface to something of significant import that she had to ask, accompanied always by a darker expression in the eyes, puzzled or searching and not on any account to be evaded or lightly answered.
"Tell me one thing, Uncle. Do these outside things come after us into the house as well?
Only when we allow them, or invite them in, he replied, taking up her mood as seriously as herself, yet knowing her question to be a feint. She knew the true answer better than himself. She wished to see what he would say. Her sly laughter of approval told him that.
They're already there, though, aren't they?
She whispered, and when he nodded agreement, she added,
Of course. They're everywhere, really, all the time. They don't move about as we do.
But she had often this singular way of seeing things and saying them from the original point of view whence she regarded them, from beneath, as it were, topsy-turvy, some might call it, almost a little mad, judging by the sheep-like vision of the majority, yet for herself entirely true, consistent, not imagined merely. Her literal use of words, too, was sometimes vividly illuminating, as though she saw language directly and robbed of the cloak with which familiar use had smothered it. She undressed phrases, making them shine out alone. "Moping, child?" he asked once, when one of her silent fits had been somewhat prolonged. "Unhappy?"
No, Uncle, and I'm not moping.
"What is it, then?"
Fraulein told me I was selfish, rather.
"Well, that's all right," he said to comfort her. "Be yourself. Selfish, or you're nothing." She followed her own thought, perhaps not understanding him quite.
She said I must put myself out more, for others. Mother used to say it too.
He turned and stared at her. The little face was very grave. "Eh?" he asked. "Put herself out?" Manya nodded, fixing her eyes, half dreamy, upon his own. She had been far away. Now she was coming back.
So I'm learning,
she said, her voice coming as from a distance.
It's so funny, but it's not really difficult, a bit. I could teach you, I think, if you promise faithfully to practice regularly.
There was a pause before he asked the next question. "How do you do it, child?" Came a little gruffly, for he felt queer emotion rising in him. She shrugged her shoulders.
Oh, I couldn't possibly tell you like that. I could only show you.
There was a touch of weirdness about the child. It stole into him, a faint sense of eeriness, as though she were letting him see through peepholes into that other world she knew so well. "Well," he asked more gently, "what happens when you have to put yourself out? Other things come in, eh?"
How can I tell?
She answered in a flash.
I'm out.
He stared at her, waiting for more. But nothing followed, and a minute later she was as usual laughing, her brilliant eyes flashing with mischief, and presently went upstairs to get tidy for their evening meal that was something between an early dinner and high tea. Only at the door she paused a second to fling him another of her characteristic phrases.
I wonder, Uncle, do you?
For she certainly knew some natural way born in her of moving herself aside and letting the tide of bigger things sweep in and use her. It was her incommunicable secret. And he did wonder a good deal. Wonder with him had never faded as with most men. It had often puzzled him why this divine curiosity about everything should disappear with the majority after 25, instead rather of steadily increasing the more one knows. Familiarity with those few scattered details the world calls knowledge has never dulled its golden edge for him. Only Manya, and the things she asked and said, gave it a violent new impetus that was like youth returned. And her notion of putting oneself out in order to let other things come in filled him with about as much wonder as he could comfortably hold just then. He dozed over the fire, thinking deeply, wishing that for a single moment he could stand where this child stood, see things from her point of view, learn the geography of the world she lived in. The source of her inspiration was nature, of course, yet he too stood close to nature and was full of sympathetic understanding for her mystery and beauty. Did Manya then stand nearer than himself? Did she perhaps dwell inside it, while he examined from the outside only, a mere onlooker, though an appreciative and loving onlooker? It came to him that things yielded up to her their essential meaning because she saw them from another side, and he recalled an illuminating line of Alice Meynell about a daisy and how wonderful it must be to see from God's side, even of such a simple thing. Manya, moreover, saw everything in some amazing fashion as one. The facts of common knowledge men studied so laboriously in isolated groups were but the jeweled facets that hung glittering upon the enormous flanks of this one. The thought flashed through his mind. He remembered another thing she said, and then another. They began to crowd his brain.
"I never dream because I know it all awake,"
she told him once, and only that afternoon when he asked her why she always stopped and stood straight before him, a habit she had. When he spoke seriously with her, she answered,
"Because I want to see you properly. I must be opposite for that. No one can see their own face, or what's next to them, can they?"
Truth, and a philosophical truth. Of no particular importance, maybe, yet strange for a child to have discovered. Even her ideas of space were singularly original, direct, unhampered by the terms that smother meaning. Up and down perplexed her. Left and right perpetually deceived her. Even inside and outside, when she tried to express them, landed her in a chaos of confusion that to most could have seemed only sheer stupidity. She stood, as it were, in some attitude of naked knowledge behind thought, perception unfettered, untaught, in which she knew that space was only a way of talking about something that no one ever really understands. She saw space, felt it rather, in some absolute sense, not yet educated to treat it relatively. She saw everything round as though her spatial perceptions were all circles, and circles are infinite, eternal. With time, too, it was somewhat similar.
"It'll come around again,"
she said once when he chided her for having left something undone earlier in the day, or,
"When I get back to it, Uncle,"
in reply to his reminding her of a duty for the following day. To the end, she was stupid about telling the time, and until he cured her of it, her invariable answer to his question, what o'clock it was, would be the literal truth that it was just now, Uncle, or simply now, as though she saw things from an absolute and not a relative point of view. She was always saying things to prove it in this curious manner, and while it made him sometimes feel uncomfortable in a way he could not quite define, it also increased his attitude of respect towards the secret, mysterious thing she hid so well, though without intending to hide it. She seemed in touch with eternal things, more than other children, not merely with a transient expression of them filtered down for normal human comprehension. Some giant thing she certainly knew. She lived it. Death, for instance, was a conception her mind failed to grasp. She could not realize it. People had left or gone away, perhaps, but somehow for her were always there. Thus started, his thoughts often traveled far, but always came up with a shock against that big black barrier, the army of the dead. The dead, of course, were always somewhere, if there was survival. But, though he had encountered strange phrases of the spiritualistic movement in America, he had known nothing to justify the theory of interference from the other side of that black barrier. The deliverances of the mediums brought no conviction. He sometimes wondered, that was all. And in particular he wondered about that member of the great army who had been for years his close and dear companion. This was natural enough. Could it be that his thought, prolonged and concentrated, formed a prison house from which escape was difficult? And had his own passionate thinking, that ever associated her memory with the place, detained one soul from farther flights elsewhere? Was this an explanation of that hint Manya so often brought him? That her presence helped to disentangle, liberate, unravel? Was the place haunted in this literal sense? The Temptation of the Clay, Part 2. Yet perhaps after all the chief change she introduced was this vital resurrection of his sense of play. For play is eternal, older than the stars, older even than dreams. She taught him afresh things he had already known, but long forgotten or laid aside. And all she knew came first direct from nature, large and undiluted. He learned, for instance, the secret of that deep quiet she possessed, even in her wildest moments, and how it came from a practice in her mother's house, where all was rush and clamor about worldly, horrid things, her practice of lying out at night to watch the stars. But not merely to watch them for a minute. She would watch for hours, following the constellations from the moment they loomed above the horizon till they set again at dawn. She saw them move slowly across the entire sky, for Mother hurried and fussed her so, and by doing this she instinctively drew into her curious wild heart the deep delight of feeling that there was lots of room, really, and no particular hurry about anything. Her inspiration was profound, from ancient sources, natural, and her play, for the same reason, was never foolish. It was creative play. It was the faculty by which the poets and dreamers recreate the world, and thus rejuvenate it. Adam knew it when he named the beasts, and Job when he made rhymes about taking Leviathan with a hook, and sang his little heart-sweet songs about the conies and the hopping hills. In the wise it never dies, for it is most subtly allied to wisdom, and only the dreamless can divorce it quite. It is the natural, untaught poetry of the soul which laughs and weeps with nature, knowing itself akin, seeing itself in everything and everything in itself. Manya, in some amazing fashion not yet educated out of her, knew nature in herself. She did naughty things, too, as he learned from Mrs. Couve, when he felt obliged to lecture her, but they were invariably typical and explanatory of her close-to-nature little being, and he understood what she felt so well that his lectures ended in laughter, with her grave defense, "Uncle, you'd have done the same yourself." Once in particular, after a fortnight of parching drought, when the gush of warm rain came with its welcome drenching soak, and the child ran out upon the balcony in her nightgown to feel it on her body too, how could he prove her wrong, having felt the same delight himself?
"I was thirsty and dry all over. I had to do it,"
she explained, puzzled, adding that of course she had changed afterwards and used the rough turkey towel, just as you do. But other things he did not understand so well, and one of these was her singular habit of imitating the sounds of nature, with an accuracy, too, that often deceived even himself. The true sounds of nature are only two, water and wind, with their many variations, and Manya, by some trick of tone and breath, could reproduce them marvelously.
"It's the way to get close,"
she told him, when he asked her why.
"The way to get inside. If you get the sound exact, you feel the same as they do, and know their things."
And the cryptic yet deeply suggestive explanation contained a significant truth that yet just evaded his comprehension. They often played it together in the woods, though he never approached her own astonishing excellence. This again stirred something like awe in him. It was a little eerie, almost uncanny, to hear her doing trees or playing wind and water. But the strangest of all her odd original tricks was one that he at length dissuaded her from practicing because he felt it stimulated her imagination unwisely and with too great conviction. It is not easy to describe, and to convey the complete success of the achievement is impossible without seeing the actual results. For she drew invisible things. Her designs, so clumsily done with a butt of pencil or even the point of her stick in the sand, managed to suggest a meaning that somehow just escaped grasping by the mind. They made him think of puzzle pictures that intentionally conceal a face or figure. Vague fluid shapes that never quite achieve an actual form ran through these scattered tracings. She used points in the scenery to indicate an outline of something other than themselves, yet something they contained and clothed. His eye vainly tried to force into view the picture that he felt laid there hiding within these points. On a large sheet of paper she would draw roughly details of the landscape, tops of trees, the mill roof, a boulder or a stretch of the stream, for instance, and persuade these points to gather the blank space of paper between them into the semblance, the suggestion, rather, of some vague figure, always vast and always very much alive. They marked within their boundaries an outline of some form that remained continually elusive. Yet the outline thus framed, whichever way you look at it, even holding the paper upside down, still remained a figure, moreover, that moved. For the child had a way of turning the paper round so that the figure had an appearance of moving independently upon itself. The reality of the whole business was more than striking, and it was when she came to give these figures names that she decided to put a stop to it. One day, another curious thing had happened. He had often thought about it since and wondered whether its explanation lay in mere child's mischief or in some power of discerning these invisible presences that she drew. They were returning together from a scramble in the gravel pit which they pretended was a secret entrance to the center of the world, and they were tired. Manya walked a little in front, as her habit was, so that she could turn and see him opposite at a moment's notice when he said an interesting thing. Her red tam-o'-shanter, with the top knot off, she carried in her hand, swinging it to and fro. From time to time she flicked it out sideways, as though to keep flies away. But there were no flies, for it was chilly and growing dark. The pines were thickly planted here, with sudden open spaces. Their footsteps fell soft and dead upon the needles, and sometimes she flung her arm out with an imperious, sudden gesture of defiance that made him feel suspicious, and look over his shoulder, for it was like signing to someone who came close, someone he could not see, but whose presence was very real to her. The unwelcome conviction grew upon him. Someone, in the world she knew apart from him, accompanied them. A few minutes before she had been wild and romping, playing at mushrooms with laughter and excitement. She loved doing this, whirling round on her toes till her skirts were horizontal, then sinking with them, ballooning round her to the ground, the tam o' shanter pulled down over her entire face, so that she looked like a giant toadstool with a crimson top. But now she had turned suddenly grave and silent.
"Uncle,"
she exclaimed abruptly, turning sharply to face him, and using the hushed tone that was always prelude to some startling question.
"Tell me one thing, please. What would you do if—"
She broke off suddenly and sprang swiftly to one side. "Manya, of what?" He did not like the movement. It was so obviously done to avoid something that stood in her way, between them, very close. He almost jumped too. "I can't tell you anything while you're darting about like a deer fly. What do you want to know?" He added with involuntary sharpness. She stood facing him with her legs astride the path. She stared straight into his eyes. The dusk played tricks with her height, always delusive. It magnified her. She seemed to stand over him, towering up.
"If someone kept walking close beside you under an umbrella," she whispered earnestly, "so that the face was hidden and you could never see it, what would you do?"
"Child, but what a question!" The carelessness in his tone was not quite natural. A shiver ran down his back. She moved closer so that he felt her breathe, and saw the gleam of her big wide-opened eyes.
"Would you knock up the umbrella with a bang?"
she whispered, as though afraid she might be overheard.
"Or just suddenly stoop and look beneath, catching it that way?"
He stepped aside to pass her, but the child stepped with him, barring his movement of escape. She meant to have her answer.
"Take it by surprise like that? I mean, would you, Uncle?"
He stared blankly at her. The conviction in her voice and manner was disquieting. "Depends what kind of thing," he said, seeing his mistake. He tried to banter and yet at the same time seem serious. But to joke with Manya in this mood was never very successful. She resented it. And above all, he did not want to lose her confidence. "Depends," he said slowly, "whether I felt it friendly or unfriendly. But I think I should prefer to knock the brolly up." For a moment she appeared to weigh the wisdom of his judgment, then instantly rejecting it.
"I shouldn't," she answered like a flash. "I should suddenly run up and stoop to see. I should catch it that way."
And before he could add a word or make a movement to go on, she darted from beside him with a leap like a deer, flew forward several yards among the trees, stooped suddenly down, then turned her head and faced up sideways as though to peer beneath something that spread close to the ground. Her skirts ballooned about her like the mushroom, one hand supporting her on the earth, while the other, holding the tam o' shanter, shaded her eyes.
Oh,
she cried the next instant, standing bolt upright again.
"It's a whole lot, and they've all gone like lightning, gone off there."
She pointed all about her, into the sky, towards the moors, back to the forest, even down into the earth, a curious sweeping gesture, then hid her face behind both hands and came slowly to his side again.
"It wasn't one, Uncle. It was a lot,"
she whispered through her fingers. Then she dropped her hands as a new explanation flashed into her.
"But perhaps after all, it was only one. Oh, Uncle, I do believe it was only one. Just fancy. How awfully splendid. I wonder."
Neither the hour nor the place seemed to him suitable for such a discussion. He put his arm round her and hurried out of the wood. He put the woods behind them, like a protective barrier for his sake as well as hers. That much he clearly realized. He somehow made a shield of them. In the garden, with the stars peeping through thin clouds, and the lights of the windows beckoning in front, he turned and said, laughing, quickening his pace at the same time, "Rabbits, Manya, rabbits! All the rabbits here use brollies, and the bunnies, too." It was the best thing he could think of at the moment. Rather neat, he thought it. But her instant answer took the wind out of his sham sails.
"That's just the name for them,"
she cried, clapping her hands softly with delight.
"Now they needn't hide like that any more. We'll just pretend they're bunnies, and they'll feel disguised enough."
They went into the house, and it was comforting to see the figure of Mother Couve filling the entire hall. At least there was no disguising her. but on the steps Manya halted a moment and gazed up in his face. She stood in front of him, deaf to Mrs. Cove's statements from the rear about wet boots. Her eyes, though shining with excitement, held a puzzled, wild expression.
"Uncle,"
she whispered with a sly laughter, standing on tiptoe to kiss him,
"I wonder,"
then flew upstairs to change before he could find a suitable reply. But he wondered too, wondered what it was the child had seen, for certainly she had seen something. Yet the thought that finally stayed with him, as after all the other queer adventures they had together, was this unpleasant one, that his so willing acceptance of the little intruder involved the disapproval, even the resentment of, another. It haunted him. He never could get quite free of it. Another watched, another listened, another waited. And Manya knew. 9. Autumn passed into winter, and spring at last came round. The dream estate was a garden of delight and loveliness, fresh green upon the larches and heather all abloom. The routine of the little household was established and seemed as if it could never have been otherwise. The relationship between the elderly uncle and his little charge was perfect now, like that between a father and his only daughter, spoiled daughter, perhaps a little, who, knowing her power, yet never took advantage of it. He loved her as his own child, and that evasive something in her which had won his respect from the first still continued to elude him. He never caught it up. It had increased, too, in the long dark months. Now with the lengthening days it came still more to the front, growing bolder, as though spring's sweet trouble in the ground summoned it forth. This sympathy between her being and the place had strengthened underground. The disentangling had gone apace. With the first warm softness of the April days he woke abruptly to the fact, and faced it. The older memories had been replaced. It seemed to him almost as though his hold upon the place had weakened. He loved it still, but loved it in some new way. And his conscience pricked him, for conscience had become identified with the trust of guardianship thus self-imposed. He had let something in, and though it was not the taint of outside country she had said would dirty it, it yet was alien. It was somehow hostile to the conditions of his original deed of trust. Then into this little world dropped like some stray bullet from a distant battle, came with a bang the person of John C. Murdoch. He came for a self-proposed visit of one day, being too rushed to stay an hour longer. Chance had put him on the trail of his old-time pard of 100 camps, and he couldn't miss looking him up, not for all the money you could shake a stick at. More like a shell than mere bullet he came, explosively and with a kind of tempestuous energy. For his vitality and speed of action were terrific, and he was making money now dead easy. So easy, in fact, that it was like picking it up in the street. "Then you've done well for yourself since those old days in Arizona," said Elliot, really pleased to see him, for a truer partner in difficult times he had never known. "And I'm glad to hear it." "That's so, boss." He had always called the Englisher thus because of his refined speech and manners. "God ain't forgot me, and I've got grub stakes now all over Europe. Just raking it in, and if you want a bit, why, name the figure and it's yours." He glanced round at the modest old-fashioned establishment, judging it evidence of unsuccess. "What line?" asked Elliot, dropping into the long-forgotten lingo. "Why, patents, bless your heart," was the reply. "They come to me as easy as mother's milk to baby, and if the heart don't wither in me first, I'll patent everything in sight. I'll patent the earth itself before I'm done." And for a whole hour, smoking one strong green cigar upon another, he gave brief and picturesque descriptions of his various enterprises, with such energy and gusto, moreover, that there woke in Elliot something of the lust of battle he had known in the wild early days, something of his zest for making a fortune, something too of the old bitter grievance, in a word, the spirit of action, eager strife, and keen achievement, which never had quite gone to sleep. "And now," said Murdoch at length, "tell me about yourself. You look fit and lively. You've had enough of my chin music. Made your pile and retired too, isn't that it? Only you still like things kind of modest and camp-like, is that so?" But Elliot found it difficult to tell. This side of him that life in England had revived to the almost complete burial of the other was one that Murdoch would not understand. For one thing, Murdoch had never seen it in his friend. The Arizona days had kept it deeply hidden. He listened with a kind of tolerant pity, while Elliot found himself giving the desired information almost in a tone of apology.
Every man to his liking.
The Westerner cut him short when he had heard less than half of the stammering tale.
And your line ain't mine, I see. I'm no shadow chaser, never was. You've changed a lot. Why,
Looking round at the little pine-clad valley,
I should think you'd rot to death in this place. There's not room to pitch a camp or feed a horse. I'd choke for want of air.
and he lit another cigar and spat neatly across 10 feet of lawn. John Casanova Murdoch, in the West he was called John Cass, or just John C., but had resurrected the middle name for the benefit of Europe, was a man of parts and character, tried courage, and unfailing in his friendship. Straight as you make 'em was the verdict of the primitive country where a man's essential qualities are soon recognized, and without no frills. And Elliot, whatever he may have thought, felt no resentment. He remembered the rough man's kindness to him when he had been a tenderfoot in more than one awkward place. John C. might rot to death in this place, and might think the vulgar country round it great stuff, but for all that his host liked to see and hear him. He remembered his skill as a mining prospector and an engineer. He was not surprised that he had at last struck oil. They talked of many things, but the visitor always brought the conversations round to his two great healthy ambitions, now on the way to full satisfaction, money and power. Upon some chance mention of religion, he waved his hand impatiently, with enough vigor to knock a man down, and said, "Religion? Hell, I only discuss facts." And his definition of a fact would no doubt have been a dollar bill, a mining proposition, or a food problem, some scheme by which John C. could make a bit. Yet though he placed religion among the fantasies, he lived it in his way. He ranked the Pope with Barnum, each of them biggest in his own line of goods, and Shakespeare was right enough, but might have made it shorter. And Elliot, listening, felt the buried portion of his nature waken and revive. It caused him acute discomfort.
"Now, show me around the little hole a bit,"
said Murdoch just before he left.
"I'd like to see the damage, just for old time's sake. It won't take above 10 minutes if we hustle along."
They hustled along. Elliot led the way with a curious deep uneasiness he could not quite explain. His heart sank within him. Gladly he would have escaped the painful duty, but Murdoch's vigorous energy constrained him. The whole way he felt ashamed, yet would have felt still more ashamed to have refused. He faced the music, as John Casanova Murdoch phrased it, and while doing so, that other music of his visitor's villainous nasal twang cut across the deep-noted murmur of the wind and water like a buzz-saw with a bit of wire trailing against its teeth. The entire journey occupied but half an hour, for Elliot made shortcuts, instinctively avoiding certain places, and the whole time Murdoch talked. His business, practical soul expanded with good nature.
"Place ain't so bad if you worked it up a bit,"
he said, striking a match on the wall of the mill and spitting into the clear water.
"But it's not much bigger than a chicken run at present. If I was you, boss, I'd have cleaned it up first."
Again he offered a check, thinking the unkempt appearance due to want of means. His uninvited opinions were freely offered as willingly as he would have given money if his old pard had needed it. Given kindly, too, without the least desire to wound. He picked out the prettiest building sites, and explained where an artificial lake could be made as easy as rolling off a log. His patent wire would fence the gardens off, and no one ever see it. And his special concrete paving, from waste material that yielded 100% profit, would make paths so neat and pretty you could dance to heaven on 'em. The place might be developed so as to knock the stuffing out of the country roundabout, and the estate become a perfect picture book. "You got a gold mine here, and God never meant a gold mine to lie unnoticed like a roadside ditch. Only you'll need to gladden it up a bit first. You can make it hum as a picnic or amusement resort for the town people. Take it from me, boss, it's so." And the effect upon Elliot as he listened was curious. It was twofold. For a while at first, the chatter wounded him like insults aimed directly at the dead. At the same time, to his deep disgust, it stirred all his former love of practical, energetic action. The old lust and fever to be up and doing, helping the world go round, making money in worldly position, woke more and more as Murdoch's vigorous, crude personality stung his will, stung also desires he thought forever dead. It made him angry to find that they were not dead, and yet he felt that he was feeble not to resent the gross invasion, even cowardly not to resist the coarse attack and kick the vulgar intruder out. It was like a breach of trust to take it all so meekly without protesting, or at least without stating forcibly his position, as though he were not sufficiently sure of himself to protect his memories and his dead. But this was the truth. He was not sure of himself. The blinding light of this simple fellow's mind showed up the hidden inequalities to himself. Another discovered his essential instability to himself. This other side of him had existed all the time, and his attachment to the place was partly artificial, built up largely by the vigorous assertion of the departed. His love had colored it wonderfully all these years, but it was a love that had undergone a change. It had not faded, but grown otherwise. Another kind of love had to some extent replaced and weakened it. He felt mortified, ashamed, but more, he felt uneasy too. The wrench was pain. If only she were here and I could explain it to her, ran his thought over and over again, followed by the feeling that perhaps she was there, listening to it all and judging him. Behind the trees, a little distance away, he saw the flitting figure of Manya, watching them as they passed noisily along the pathways of her secret playground. Her attitude, even at this distance, expressed resentment. He imagined her indignant eyes. But closer than that, another watched and followed, listened and disapproved. That other whom she knew yet never spoke about, who was in league with her, and seemed more and more to him like a phantom risen from the dead. With difficulty and with an uneasiness growing every minute now, he gave his attention to his talkative, well-meaning, though almost offensive guest, at once insufferable yet welcome. One moment he saw him in his camping kit of 20 years ago, with big sombrero and pistols in his belt, and the next as he was today, reeking of luxury and money, in a London black tailcoat, white Homburg hat, diamonds shining on his fingers and in his gaudy speckled tie, his pointed patent leather boots gleaming insolently through the bracken and heather. And through his silence crashed a noise of battle that he thought the entire place must hear. But clear issue to the battle there was none. The opposing sides were matched with such deadly equality. Which was his real self lay in the balance, until at last John Casanova unwittingly turned the scales. It came about so quickly, with such calculated precision as it were, that Elliot almost felt it had all been prepared beforehand, and Murdoch had come down on purpose. It was like a sudden flank attack that swept him from his last defenses. Help that could not reach him in the form of Manya signaled from the distance with her shining eyes, her red tam-o'-shanter, the banner of reinforcements that arrived too late. For John C. stood triumphantly before him, a conqueror in his last dismantled fortress. His face alighted with enthusiasm that was all excitement. He held his hands out towards him, cup-wise. "See here," he said with excitement, but in a hard, dry tone that reminded Elliot of prospecting days in Arizona. "Boss, will you take a look at this, please?" He had been rooting about in the heather by the edge of the sandpits, and he thrust his joined hands beneath the other's nose. Something the size of a hen's egg, something that shone a dirty white, lay in them against the thick gold rings. "Didn't I tell you the place was a gold mine? Well, what's the use of talking? Will you look at this now?" He repeated it with the air of a man who has suddenly discovered the secret of the world. The voice was quiet with intense excitement, kept hard under, and Elliot obeyed and looked. He saw his visitor, his Bond Street trousers turned up high enough to show the great muscles of his calves, the Homburg hat tilted across one eye, coat sleeves pulled up and smeared with a whitish mud. There was perspiration on his forehead. It only needed the sombrero and the pistols to complete the picture of 20 years ago, when Cass Murdoch, after weeks of heavy labor, found the first gold dust in his pan. For John C. had found gold. It lay, a dirty lump of white earth, in his large spread hands. Those hands were the pan. The breeze that murmured through the pine trees came, sweet and keen, from leagues of open plain and virgin mountains far away. Elliot smelt the wood fire smoke of camp, heard the crack of the rifle as someone killed the dinner. "Well, John C.," he gasped as he dropped back likewise into the vanished pocket of the years. "What's your luck? Out with it, man, out with it." "A fortune," replied his visitor. "Put your finger on it right now, and don't tell Mother or burst out crying unless you're forced to." High pleasure was in his voice. He stepped closer, transferring the lump of dirt into the hand his host unconsciously stretched open to receive it. It lay there a moment, looking even dirtier than before against the more delicate skin. Elliot felt it with finger and thumb. It was soft and sticky and a little moist. It stained the flesh. Then he looked up and stared into his companion's eyes, blankly. A horrible excitement worked underground in him, but he did not even yet understand.
"You've got it,"
observed John C., with dry finality.
"Got what?"
asked Elliot.
"Got it right there in your waistcoat pocket,"
said the other with an air of supreme satisfaction. His cigar had gone out. He lit it again in leisurely fashion, spat accurately at a distant frond of bracken, eyed the lump of dirt again with inimitable pride, and added, "Got it without asking. The working's soft and easy, too. Water power on the spot and the sea all close and handy for shipping it away." He made a gesture to indicate the tumbling stream and the seacoast a few miles beyond. Then, seeing that his host still stared with blank comprehension, holding the little lump at arm's length as though it might bite or burn him, he deigned to explain with a note of condescending pity in his voice, as of a man explaining to a stupid child.
"Clay,"
he said calmly,
"and good stuff at that."
"Clay?" repeated Elliot, still a little dazed, though light was breaking on him. "Bricks?" he asked, with a dull sinking of the heart.
"Bricks nothing,"
snapped the other with impatient scorn, as though his friend were still a tenderfoot in Arizona.
"Good white pottery clay, and soft as baby's tongue. The best God ever laid down for man, worth twice its weight in dust, and all to be had for the trouble of shoveling it out. Old Pard, you've struck it good and hot this time, and here's my blessing on your both."
Elliot dropped the lump his fingers held so long, and took half-heartedly the giant hand that squeezed his own. Across his brain ran visions of slender vases, exquisite white cups and bowls and pitchers, plates and sweet-rimmed basins, all fashioned in delicate-toned shades of glaze, beautifully finished pottery, worth twice their weight in dust. 10. And a half-hour later, when John Casanova Murdoch had boomed away in his luxurious motor car like a departing thunderstorm, Elliot, coming back by the pine wood that led from the high road, heard a step behind him, and turned to find Manya's face looking over his shoulder.
"Uncle, who was that?"
There was a touch of indignation in her voice that was almost contempt. "Man I knew in America, years ago," he said shortly. He still felt dazed, bewildered, but shame and uneasiness came creeping up as well.
"He won't come again, will he?"
"Not again, Manya." The child took his arm, apparently only half relieved.
"He was like a bit of the dirty country,"
she said, and when he interrupted with, "Not quite so bad as that, Manya?" she asked abruptly with her usual intuition,
"Did he want to buy or build or something horrid like that?"
"We haven't met for 20 years, he said evasively. "Used to hunt and camp together in America. He went to the goldfields with me." He was debating all the while whether he should tell her all. He hardly knew what he thought. Like a powerful undertow there drove through the storm of strange emotions the tide of a decision he had already come to. It swept him from all his moorings, though as yet he would not acknowledge it even to himself.
"Uncle,"
she cried suddenly, stepping across the path and looking anxiously into his face,
"tell me one thing. Will anything be different?"
And the simple question, or perhaps the eager, wistful expression in her voice and eyes, showed him the truth that there was no evading. He must tell her sometime. Why not now? He decided to make a clean sweep of it. "Manya," he began gently, "this place one day, when I am gone, you know, will be your own. But there'll be no money with it. You'll have very little to live on." She said nothing, just listening with a little air of boredom as though she knew this already, yet felt no special interest in it. It belonged to the world of things she could not realize much. She nodded. They still stood there face to face. "I've been anxious, child, for a long time about your future," he went on, meeting her dark eyes with a distinct effort, for they seemed to read the shame he felt rising in his heart, "and wondering what I could do to make you safe."
"I'm safe enough,"
she interrupted, tossing her hair back and raising her chin a little. "But when I'm gone," he said gravely, "and Mrs. Couve is gone,
and there's no one to look after you. Money's your only friend, then."
She seemed to reflect. She moved aside, and they walked on slowly towards the house.
"That's a long way off, Uncle. I'm not afraid."
"But it's my duty to provide for you, as well as possible," he said firmly. And then he told her bluntly, and in as few words as possible, of the discovery of the clay. The excitement at first in the child was so great that nothing would satisfy her but that they should at once turn back and see the place together. They did so, while he explained how Mr. Murdoch, who was learned in strata, their depth and dip and outcrop, had declared that this deposit of fine white clay was very large. Its spread below the heather roots might be tremendous. "My aunt," he said, "your great-aunt Julia, lived all her life upon a gold mine here without knowing it, poor as a church mouse." This particularly thrilled her.
"How funny that she never felt it,"
was her curious verdict.
"Was she very deaf?"
"Stone deaf, yes," he replied, laughing, "and short-sighted, too."
"Ah,"
said the child, as though things were thus explained.
"What she might have digged."
She ran among the heather when he showed her the place, found lumps of clay, played ball with them, and was wildly delighted. She treated the great discovery as a game, then as a splendid secret.
"Just between us two."
Mr. Murdoch wouldn't tell, would he? That seemed the only danger that she saw, at first. But her uncle knew quite well that this excitement was all false, and far from reassuring him, it merely delayed the deeper verdict that was bound to come with full comprehension. All the discovery involved had not yet reached her brain. As yet, she realized only the novelty, the mystery, the wonder. The spot, moreover, where the great deposit showed its lip was beside the loveliest part of all the wood, and just where the child most loved to play. At last, then, as her body grew tired and the excitement brought the natural physical reaction, he saw the change begin. She paused and looked about her, half suspiciously, like an animal that suspects a trap. Her glance ran questioningly to where her uncle leaned, watching her against a tree. She eyed him. He thought she suddenly looked different, though wherein the difference lay escaped him. He felt as if he were watching a wild animal, only half tamed, that distrusts its owner, and would next deny his mastership and wait its opportunity to spring. The simile, he knew, was exaggerated, but the picture rose within him none the less. Misgiving and uneasiness grew apace. Abruptly, Manya stopped her wild playing and with the movement of a little panther ran towards him. She took up a position, as usual, directly opposite. With the strange air of dignity that sometimes clothed her, the figure of the child stood there among the darkening trees and asked him questions, keen, searching questions. He was grateful for the shadows, though he felt they did not screen his face from her piercing sight. But it was her imperious manner above all that made his defense seem so clumsily insincere, and the questions a veritable inquisition. Before the flood of them, as before their pitiless scrutiny, he certainly quailed. Their keen directness convicted him almost of treachery, and he was hard put to it to persuade her and himself that it really was a sense of duty he obeyed in this decision to work the clay. "I'm doing it all for her," he repeated again and again to himself, and loathed with a dash of terror that curious sudden drive, as of a blow from outside, that sent his tongue into his cheek. But the terror, he dimly divined, was due to another feeling as well, equally vague yet equally persistent. For it seemed that while she listened to his explanations, another listened in the darkness too. Her resentment and distress he realized vividly, but he felt also the resentment and distress of another. And more than once during this strange dialogue in the darkening wood he knew the horrible sensation that this other had come very close, so close as to slip between himself and the child. Almost that the child was being used as the instrument to express the vehement protest. But he faced the music, to use the lingo of John C., and spared himself nothing. He told Manya, though briefly, that workmen must swarm all through her secret playground, that machinery must grind and boom across the haunted valleys, that the water of her little stream must yield the power to turn great ugly wheels, and that perhaps even a little railway might be built to convey the loads of precious clay down to the sea, where streamers would call for them. Acres of trees, too, would be swept away, and heatherland marred and scarred with pits and ditches and quarries. But the benefits in time would be all hers. He put it purposely at its worst, while emphasizing as best he could the interest and excitement that must accompany the developments. The dream of many years was nevertheless shattered into bits in half an hour. The child listened and understood. He was relieved if puzzled at the same time that she betrayed no emotion of disappointment or indignation. What she felt, she dealt with in her own way, inside. At the stream, however, on her way home, she paused a moment, watching it slip through the darkness underneath the old mill wheel.
"It won't run any more for itself,"
she said in a low, trembling little voice that was infinitely pathetic. "No, but it will run for you, Manya," he answered, though the words had not been addressed really to him. "Working away busily for your future." And then she burst into tears and hid her face against his coat. He found no further thing to say. He walked beside her, feeling like a criminal found out. But at the end, as they neared the house side by side, she suddenly turned and asked another question that caused him a thrill of vivid surprise and discomfort. So vivid, in fact, that it was fear. They were standing just beneath her bedroom window then. Memory rushed back upon him with overwhelming force, and he glanced up instinctively at the empty panes of glass. It was almost as though he expected to see a face looking reproachfully down upon him. Through him, like spears of ice, as he heard the words, there shot again the atrocious sensation that it was not Manya, the child, who asked the question, but that other who had recently moved so close. For behind the tone, with no great effort to conceal it either, trailed a new accent that Manya never used. Greater than resentment, it was anger, and within the anger lay the touch of a yet stronger note, the note of judgment.
"But tell me one thing, Uncle," she asked in a whispering voice. "Will the place let you?"
11. Motive, especially in complex natures, is often beyond reach of accurate discovery, and a mixed motive may prove quite impossible of complete disentanglement. But for the sense of shame that Elliot felt, he might never have discerned that, with his genuine desire to provide for Manya's future, there was also involved a secret satisfaction that he himself would profit too. The sight of gold demolishes pretense and artifice, and deep within he felt the old lust of possession and acquisition assert itself. All these years it had been buried, not destroyed. His love of the place, his worship of memory, his guardianship of the little dream estate, compared to the prize of worldly treasure, were on the surface. They were artificial. This little thing had proved it. The child's tears, her significant question above all, had shown him to himself. If not, whence came this sense of ignominy before her own purer passion, the loss of confidence, this inner quailing before another who gazed reprovingly, resentfully, upon him from the shadows of the past? That note of menace in Manya's suggestive question was surely not her own. It haunted him. Day and night he heard it ringing in his brain. This new distrust of himself that he recognized read into it something almost vindictive and revengeful. But Elliot, for all that, was not the man to give in easily. He resolutely dismissed this birth of morbid fancy. Clinging to the thought that his duty to his niece came first, he resisted the suggestion that imputed a grosser selfishness. Cass Murdoch, too, unwittingly helped. For the side of his character John C.'s visit had revived. The love of fight and energetic action came valiantly to the rescue. To a great extent, he persuaded himself that his motive was, almost entirely, a pure one. Preparations for developing the clay went forward steadily. Manya, too, appeared to help him. She said no more distressing things. She showed keen interest in the coming and going of surveyors, architects, soil experts, and the like. And Murdoch's discovery was no false alarm. The bed of clay was deep and extensive, as he prophesied, its quality very fine. Men came with pick and shovel, sample pits were dug. The stuff was tested and judged excellent, and the verdict of the manufacturers to whom lots were forwarded on approval pronounced it admirable for a large and ready market. There was money in it, and the supply would last for years. The papers heralded the fortunate discoverer, and a moderate fortune undeniably was in sight. The preparations, however, took time, and the finding of the initial capital, which Murdoch readily supplied, also took time, and spring meanwhile slipped into summer before the enterprise was fairly on its feet. Soft winds sighed lazily among the larches, and the scent of flowers pervaded every valley. The pine trees basked in the sunshine, the pearly water laughed and sang, and at night the moon shot every glade with magic that was like the wings of moths, whose flitting scattered everywhere the fine dust of 1,000 silvery dreams. The beauty of the little haunted estate leaped into a rich maturity that was utterly enchanting, like wildflowers that are sweetest just before they die. And over Manya, too, there passed slowly a mysterious change, for it seemed as if for a time she had been standing still, and now with a sudden leap of beauty passed into the glory of young womanhood. With her short skirts and tumbled hair, her grave and wistful face, swinging idly that red tam-o'-shanter from which she was inseparable, he saw her one evening on the lawn outside his study window, and the change flashed into him across the moonlight with a positive shock. The child had suddenly grown up. A barrier stood between them. But the barrier was not so sudden as it seemed, for, on looking back, he realized the daily, almost imperceptible manner of its growth. Its complete erection he realized now, but he had been aware of it for a long time, ever since his decision to work the clay, in fact. Here was the proof her deceptive silence had concealed. She had felt it too deeply for words, for arguing, for disappointment volubly expressed, but it had struck into the roots of her little being and had changed her from within outwards. It had aged her. Reality had broken in upon her world of play and dream. He had destroyed her childhood at a single blow. She questioned, doubted, and grew old. But though everyone grows older, and identically this way, by sudden leaps, as it were, due to the forcing impulse of some strong emotion, with Manya it brought no radical alteration. She deepened rather than definitely changed. The sense of wonder did not fade, but ripened. The crude facts of life could never really satisfy a nature such as hers, and though she realized them now for the first time, they could not enter to destroy. They drove her more deeply into herself. That is, she dealt with them. And the change, though he devoted hours of pondering reflection over it, may be summed up briefly enough insofar as it affected himself. There was a difference in their relationship. He stood away from her, while she, on her side, drew nearer to something else that was not himself. With this elusive and mysterious thing she lived daily. She took sides with it, and with the place against himself. It went on largely, he felt, behind his back. She grew more and more identified with some active influence that had always been at work in all the wild gardened loveliness of the property, but was now more active than before. Stirred up and roused it was. He could almost imagine it aggressive. And Manya, always knowing it at closer quarters than himself, was now in definite league with it. There was opposition in it, though an opposition as yet inactive. And in the silent watches of the night sometimes, when imagination wove her pictures all unchecked, he again knew the haunting thought close beside his bed, that the mind and hand of the dead were here at work, using the delicate instrument of this rare sensitive child to convey protest, resentment, warning. Over the little vales from all the depth of forest and above the spread of moorland just beyond, there breathed this atmosphere of disapproval. Manya, never telling him much, now told him less than before, for he had forfeited the right to know. If it made him smile a little to notice that she had made Mother Couve lengthen her dresses, it did not make him smile to learn that she still wore her old shorter ones once the darkness fell, or that she now went out to play in her wild corners of the woods chiefly after dusk. For he saw the significance of this simple maneuver, and divined its meaning. She felt shy now in the daylight. This new thing in the spirit of the place had changed it all. She could not be abandoned as before, go naked and undressed as once she graphically put it. The vulgar influence from outside had come in. It stared offensively. It asked questions, leered, turned everything common and unclean. And she changed from time to time her playground as the workmen drove her out. She moved from place to place, seeking new corners and going farther into the moors and open spots. She followed the stream, for instance, nearer to its source where its waters still ran unstained, and from the neighborhood of the sample pits that gaped like open sores amid the beauty, she withheld herself completely. Nothing could persuade her to come near them. Towards himself especially, her attitude was pregnant with suggestion, and though he made full allowance for the phantom's conscience raises, there always remained the certainty that the child and another within her watched him sharply from a distance. She was still affectionate and simple, even with a new touch of resigned docility that was very sweet, as though resolved to respect his older worldly wisdom, yet with an air of pity for his great mistake that was half contempt, half condescension. Her silence about the progress of the work made him feel small. It so mercilessly judged him. And while the dignity he had always recognized in her increased, it seemed now partly borrowed. His imagination leaned more and more towards this unwelcome explanation, from this invisible companion who overshadowed her. He felt as though this silence temporarily blocked channels along which something would presently break out with violence and scorn to overwhelm him, till at last he came to regard her as a prisoner regards the foreman of the jury, who has formed his verdict and is merely waiting to pronounce it guilty. Behind her, as behind the foreman, gathered the composite decision of more than one, and the decision was hostile. It urged her on against him. Opposition accumulated towards positive attack. He dreaded some revelation through the child, and piling guess on guess, he felt certain who was this active influence that sought to use her as its instrument. The dead now, day and night, stood very close beside him. And meanwhile, things ran far from smoothly with the work itself. Unforeseen difficulties everywhere arose to baffle him. Even Murdoch made oppressive, troublesome conditions about the money that seemed unnecessary, insisting upon details of management with a touch of domineering interference that exasperated. Obstacles rose up automatically, involving, as it were, the very process of nature itself. There was a strike that delayed the railway builders for a month, and when they returned, the heavy summer rains had washed yards of embankment down again. Soon afterwards, a falling tree killed a workman, and there ensued compensation worries that threatened a lawsuit. The clay itself, too, played them sudden tricks, proving faulty the maps the surveyors had drawn. Its depths and direction were not as supposed, its angle to the lie of the slope deceptive, so that an extra branch of single line for the trunks became essential. And the money was insufficient. Further advances became imperative, and though readily forthcoming, involved more delay. The spirit of lonely peace and beauty departed from the place, hiding its injured face among the moorland reaches further up. Obstruction with turmoil and confusion at its back rose up on every side to baffle him. Though the advance was steady enough on the whole and the difficulties were only such as most similar enterprises encounter, Elliot was conscious more and more of this sense of obstacles deliberately imposed. It all seemed so nicely calculated to cause the maximum of trouble and delay. The interference was so cunningly maneuvered. He brought all his old energy and force to meet them, but there was ever this curious sense of advised and determined opposition that began to sap his confidence. "More trouble, sir," the foreman said one morning when Elliot went down to view the work, unaccompanied as usual by Manya. "There seems no end to it. What is it this time?" He abhorred these conversations now. It always seemed that another stood behind his shoulder listening. "The clay's gone," was the curious answer. He said it as though it had gone purposely to spite them like a living thing. "Gone?" he exclaimed incredulously. "Sunk away. Gone deeper than we expected," was the answer. The man shrugged his shoulders as though something puzzled him. "A kind of subsidence come in the night," he added gloomily. They stared at one another for a full minute with eyes that screened other meanings. Elliot felt a sort of fury rise within him. Somehow the idea of foul play crossed his mind, though instantly rejected as absurd. "With this loose sandy bottom and a steep slope that ain't drained properly, you're never very sure where you are," said the man at length, feeling his position made some explanation necessary. He seemed to regard the clay as something ever on the move. "I see," said Elliot, grateful for a solution that he could apparently accept. They talked of ways and means to circumvent it. "Queerest job I ever come across, sir," the foreman muttered. as at length Elliot turned away, pretending not to hear it. And scenes like this were frequent. Another time it was the white weed, with the pretty little flower Manya loved to twine about her tam o'shanter, that had gathered so thickly on the artificial ponds where the water was stored that it clogged the machinery till the wheels refused to turn. And next, a group of men that quit working without any reasonable excuse, open symptom of a hidden dissatisfaction that had been running underground for weeks. There was something about the job they didn't like. Rumors for a long time had been current. Queer, unsubstantiated rumors that those in authority chose to disregard. Superstition hereabouts was rife enough without encouraging it. Taken altogether, as products of a single hostile influence at work, these difficulties easily assumed in his imaginative mind the importance of a consciously directed opposition. He remembered often now those words of Manya, the last time she had opened her lips upon the subject, for she had credited the place with the power of resisting him. Only by the place she now meant this mysterious personal influence that she knew behind it. Yet he persisted in his consciousness of doing right. His duty to the child was clear. Her future was in his charge, and the fact that he meant to leave her everything proved that his motive, or part of it at least, was above suspicion. From John C. he also gathered comfort and support. He had only to imagine him standing by his side, repeating that remark about religion to feel strong again in his determination. Cass Murdoch recognized no mystery or subtlety anywhere. He discussed only facts. The consciousness that he was partly traitor nonetheless remained, and with it the feeling that the very tradition he had nursed and worshipped all these years was up in arms against him. Manya, standing closer to nature than himself, had divined this tradition and, in some fashion curiously her own, had personified it. And this personification linked on with the dead. His love of the beauty and his love of a particular memory he had read into the place, she had most marvelously disentangled. Both were genuine in him, yet he had suffered them in combination to produce a false and artificial image existing only in his own imagination. There was conflict in his being. His motive was impure. Behind them stood the giant naked thing the child divined that was reality. She knew it face to face. What was it? The mere definite question which he permitted himself made him sometimes hesitate and wait, not unwilling to call a halt. He was aware that the child stood ever in the background, waiting her time with that sly laughter of superior knowledge. These obstacles and difficulties were sent as warnings, and while he disregarded them of set purpose, something deep within him paused to question, and while it questioned, trembled. For protest, he seemed to discern, had become resentment. Resentment growing into resistance. Resistance into hostile opposition. And opposition now, with something horribly like anger at its back, was hinting already at a blank refusal that involved almost revenge. Hitherto he had been hindered, impeded, thwarted merely. Soon he could be deliberately overruled and stopped. Nature, ever defeating an impure motive, would rise up against him and cry finally, "No."
"But, Uncle, tell me one thing. Will the place let you?"
rang now more often through his daily thoughts. He heard it more especially at night. At night, too, when sleep refused him, he surprised himself more than once, framing sentences of explanation and defense. They rose automatically. They followed him even into his dreams. "My duty to the child is plain. How can I help it? If you were here beside me now, would you not also approve?" For the idea that she was beside him grew curiously persuasive, so that he almost expected to see her in the corridors, or on the stairs, standing among the trees, or waiting for him by the mill itself, where last she drew the breath of life. And by way of a climax came then Manya's request to change her room, and his own decision to move himself into the one she vacated. The reason she gave was that the trees made such a noise at night she could not sleep, and since it had 3 windows, 2 of which were almost brushed by pine branches, the excuse, though discovered late, seemed natural enough. At any rate, he did not press her further. She occupied a room now at the back, where a single window gave a view far up into the moors, and turning out the unnecessary furniture to suit his taste, he moved into the one she had vacated, his wife's. The Temptation of the Clay, Part 3. Summer passed in the leisurely, gorgeous way that sometimes marks its passage into autumn, and the work plowed forward through the sea of difficulties. The conspiracy of obstacles continued. There was progress on the whole, but a progress that seemed to bring success no nearer. The beds of clay, however, were definitely determined now, and their extent and depth fulfilled the most sanguine expectations. The troubles lay with the railway, the men, water, weather, and a dozen things no one could have foreseen. These seemed far-fetched and yet were natural enough, and they continued until Elliot, never a man who yielded easily, began to feel he had undertaken more than he could manage. He weakened. The idea came to him that he would sell his interest and leave the development to others. To retire from the fight and acknowledge himself defeated was a step he could not lightly take. There was a bitterness in the thought that stung his pride and vanity. There was also the fact that if he held on and first established a paying business, he could obtain far more money for Manya. Yet he felt somehow that it was from Manya herself that the suggestion first had come. For the child gave hints in 100 different ways that he could not possibly misunderstand. They were indirect, unconsciously given, and they followed invariably upon curious little personal accidents that about this time seemed almost a daily occurrence. And these little accidents, though perfectly natural, taken one by one as they occurred, when regarded altogether seemed to compose a formidable whole. They pointed an attack almost. The menace he had imagined was becoming aggressive. Someone who knew his habits was playing him tricks. Someone with intimate knowledge of the way he walked and ran and moved laid traps for him. And at each little accident, Manya laughed her strange, sly laughter, precisely as a child who says, "I told you so, you brought it on yourself." She had expected it, perhaps had seen it coming, and now, to avoid more grave disasters, she wanted him elsewhere. Her deep affection for him, sinner though he was in her eyes, sought to coax him out of the danger zone. When he slipped in jumping the stream, he, who was sure-footed as a mountain goat, and turned his ankle, and when the heavy earth, loosened by the rains, rolled down upon him as he climbed the embankment, or when the splinter that entered his hand as he vaulted the fencing near the wharf led to festering that made him carry his arm in a sling for days. In every case it was the same. The child looked up at him and smiled her curious little smile of one who knew. She was in safety, but he stood in the line of fire. She knew who it was that laid the traps. She saw them being laid. It was always wood, earth, water, thus that hurt him, and never once an artificial contrivance of man.
"Uncle, it wouldn't happen if you stayed away,"
was what she said each time, though never phrased the same. And the obvious statement only just covered another meaning that her words contained. She knew worse things would come, and feared for him.
"There's no good hiding, Uncle Dick, because it's in the house as well."
He grew to feel unwelcome in his own woods and garden, an intruder in his own moors and valleys, an element the place rejected and wished elsewhere. The place had begun to turn him out, and Manya, this queer, mysterious child in league with the secret influence at work against him, was being used to point the warnings and convey the messages. Her silent attitude, more even than her actual words, was the messenger. The hints thus brought, moreover, now troubled themselves less and less with disguise. He realized them at last for what they were, and they were beyond equivocation, threatening. And it was at this point that Elliot made the journey up to London to see Cass Murdoch and feel his way towards escape. Retirement was the word he used, and the sentence John C. heard in the bar of the big hotel as they discussed clay and cocktails was, "Sell my interests to more competent hands who will get quicker and bigger results than I can. The work and worry affect my health." The interview may be easily imagined, for John Casanova Murdoch was more than willing to buy him out, though the conditions, with one exception, have no special interest in this queer history. Elliot was to lease the place for a period of years, and this meant leaving it. In the train on his way back, his emotions fought one another in a regular pitched battle. He stood in front of himself suddenly revealed, a traitor. It seemed as if for a moment he saw things a little from his niece's inverted point of view, standing outside of self and looking up. It provided him with unwelcome sensations that escaped analysis. Love and hate are one and the same force, according to the point in the current where one stands. Repulsion becomes, from the opposite end, attraction, and a great love may be reversed into a great hate. There is no exact dividing line between heat and cold, no neat frontier where pleasure becomes pain, just as there is really no such absolute thing as left and right, uphill and downhill, above and below. Manya stood outside these relative distinctions men have invented for the common purposes of description. He understood at last that the power which had drawn his life into the place as by a kind of absorption was now inverted into a process of turning him out again as by a kind of determined elimination. It was being accomplished, moreover, as he felt and phrased it to himself, from outside, by which perhaps he meant from beyond that fence which men presumptuously assume to contain all the life there is. But the dead stand also beyond that fence, and Manya, being so obviously in league with this hostile eliminating influence, stood hand in hand, therefore, with the dead. But for him, the dead meant only one. 13. He walked home from the station, which he reached at 9 o'clock. Crossing the zone of the dirty country, now successful invader of the dream estate, he entered his property at length by the upper end of the piney valley. A passionate wind was searching the trees for music, and handfuls of rain were flung against the trunks like stones. But on leaving the road, the tempest seemed to pass out towards the sea, leaving an unexpected sudden hush about his footsteps. The moon peered down through high scudding clouds. It was partly that the storm was breaking up, and partly that the valley provided shelter. But it gave him the feeling that he had entered a little world prepared for his reception. He was expected, the principal figure in it. Attention everywhere focused on himself. He felt like a prisoner who comes out of streets indifferent to his presence and enters a court of law. This ominous silence preceded the arrival of the judge. The path at once dipped downwards into a world of shadows where the splashes of moonlight peered up at him like faces on the ground. He heard the water murmuring out of sight, and it came about his ears like whispering from the body of the court. There reigned, indeed, the same gentle peace and stillness he had known for years, but somewhere in it a brooding, unaccustomed element that was certainly neither peace nor stillness. Something unwanted stirred slowly, very grandly through the darkness. He paused a moment to listen. He looked about him. He pushed aside the bracken with his stick, and his eyes glanced up among the lower branches of the trees. And everywhere it seemed he encountered other eyes usually veiled, but now with lifted lids. Then he went on again, faster a little than before. A touch of childhood's terror chilled his blood, and it took at first a childhood's form. He thought of some big savage animal that lurked in hiding, its presence turning the once friendly wood all otherwise undreadful. A giant paw filled the little valley to the brim. The stir of the wind was the opening and shutting of its claws. The lips were drawn back to show the gums and teeth. Something opened. There came a rush of air. The awful spring would follow in a moment. Another hood of memory lifted then and showed him Manya as she played about the sandpits, then paused when the full discovery dawned upon her mind. She had eyed him. She had given him this similar impression of an animal waiting its opportunity to spring. But now it was the place that waited to spring. He banished the bizarre, exaggerated picture his imagination conjured up, but could not banish the emotion that produced it. The place was different. Change spread all over it. Potential attack hummed through the very air. Thus might a man feel walking through a hostile crowd, but thus also might he feel in the presence of a friend to whom in a time of confidence he had betrayed himself too lavishly. A friend now turned against him with this added power of knowing all his secrets. His own imagination leaped upon him, calling him coward, traitor, unfaithful steward. Fear made him bitterly regret the familiarity that years of unguarded dreaming had established between himself and... His mind hesitated horribly between the choice of pronouns, and when he finally chose the neuter, it It seemed that a curious running laughter passed within the sounds of wind and water. It almost was like the mockery of Manya's laughter taken over by the dying storm. While he evaded the direct attack, his mind, however, continued searching for the word that should describe accurately, and so limit all this vague, distressing feeling of hostility. But for long he could not find it. The new element that breathed through the somber intricacies of the glen played with him as it pleased, until he could catch it in the proper word, and so imprison it. Branches seemed no longer soft and feathery. They bristled, pointed, stood rigid for a blow. The stream no longer murmured. It laughed and cried aloud. The shadows did not cover smoothly. They concealed. And the whole atmosphere of the place, instead of welcoming, repelled. And then, quite suddenly, the word emerged and stood before his face. Disturbance. Less than disorder, yet more than mere disquietude. This word described the attitude he was conscious of. In its aggressive, threatening, sinister meaning, he accepted it as true. There was disturbance. Somewhere in those chains of iron that bind the operations of nature within invariable, unyielding laws, a link had weakened. Disturbance was the result. But a disturbance that somehow let in purpose, urging everywhere through the manifestations of nature in his dream estate, was the drive and stress of purposiveness. The discovery of the word, moreover, announced the approach, though not yet the actual entrance, of the judge. There were steps, and the steps were in himself. Someone walked upon his life. He quickened his pace like a terrified child. With genuine relief at last he reached the house. But even in the friendly building he was aware of this keen discomfort at his heels. It penetrated easily. The disturbance came in after him into the house itself. Hanging up coat and hat, he then passed into the study, and the prosaic business of drinking milk and munching water biscuits scattered the strange illusion for a time. It weakened, at any rate, for it never wholly disappeared. It waited. The house was silent, everyone in bed. He locked the front door carefully, stared at his face a moment in the hat-stand mirror, wondering at a certain change in the expression of the features, though he could not name it, and with his lighted candle went on tiptoe up to bed. But the instant he entered the room, he was aware that the feeling of distress had already preceded him. He was forestalled. There was this dark disquiet in the very atmosphere of his bedroom. The disturbance had established itself in these most private, intimate quarters that once had been his wife's. It was strongest here. Dismissing a sharp desire to sleep in another room, anywhere but in the place made sacred by long-worshipped memories, he began to undress. He said to himself with a certain vehemence, "I'll ignore the thing." But it was fear that said it. A frightened child without a light might as well determine to ignore the darkness, for this thing was urgent everywhere about him, inside and outside, like the air he breathed. And the next minute, instead of ignoring it, he made an attempt to face it. He would drag the secret out. The fact was, both will and emotions were already in disorder. He knew not how or where to take the thing. The attempt then showed him another thing. It was no secret. The terror in his heart and conscience made presence of screening something that he really knew quite well. This aggressive, hostile presence was a presence that he recognized, and had recognized all along. And instinctively he turned to this side and to that, examining the room. For space in this room, he realized, was no longer quite as usual. There was a change in its conditions. Everything contained within it, the very object between the four walls, were affected. He felt them altered. They had become otherwise. He himself was changed as well, become otherwise. And if anything alive, another person, or an animal even, came in, they also, in some undetermined, startling way, would look otherwise than usual. They would look different. Hurriedly, he sought a concrete simile to steady his shaking mind on, and his mind provided this: that if the temperature were suddenly lowered, the invisible moisture would at once appear otherwise. Frost crystals on the window panes, snow, and so forth. The change would not be untrue or even distorted, no falseness in it anywhere, nor exaggeration, only otherwise. and if the presence of the dead, whom he felt so close now in this room, turned visible owing to the changed conditions of the space about him, he would see. But the thought remained unfinished in his mind. He thrust the terror down into the depths, yet the idea must have been very insistent in him, for he crossed the floor on tiptoe to lock the door securely, and stood already within easy reach of it, one hand actually stretched out, when there came a faint knocking on the paneling within a few inches of his very face. He saw the handle turn. With suggestive, dreadful stealthiness, the door then opened, the merest crack at first, then gradually wider and wider, and the slowness was exasperating. The seconds dragged like hours. Had he not been spellbound, he would have violently slammed it to again or torn it instead wide open. There was just time in his bewildered mind to wonder what form this presence from the dead would take, when he realized that the figure stood already by his side. She had crossed the threshold. With amazement, he saw that it was Manya. She came in swiftly. She was on the carpet close against him before he could speak a word or move, and she looked, as he had expected, otherwise. She looked extraordinary. The word came to him in the way she might herself have used it, getting its first meaning out. Extraordinary. And her appearance was, might well have been, at least, ludicrous. For she was dressed to go out, but in a fashion that at any other time must have been cause for laughter. Now it stood at the very opposite pole, however. It was superb. Her red tam-o'-shanter was perched carelessly, almost gaily on her hair, which was already fashioned into plaits for the night. And underneath the garden jacket that he knew so well, he saw white drapery that plainly was her little nightgown. She had pulled her stockings on, but had not fastened them. They hung down, partly showing her skin below the knee. The boots flapped open with no attempt to button them. Her hurry had been evidently great, and she looked at the first glance like someone surprised by a midnight call of fire. Yet these details, which he took in a single glance, stirred no faintest touch of amusement in him, for about her whole presentment was this other nameless quality that showed her to him, utterly otherwise than usual. It made him wince and shudder, yet pause in a wondering amazement too, amazement that barely held back awe. He stared like a man struck suddenly dumb. The phrase the child so often used came back upon him with the force of a shock. The girl had put herself out. This being that stood just opposite to his face was not Manya. It was another. It was the other. And both doubt and knowledge dropped down upon him in that fearful moment. Knowledge that it was the influence she had been so long in league with, and that sought to use her as its instrument of protest, and doubt as to exactly what or who this influence really was. For it came to him as being so enormously bigger and vaster than anything his mind could label the dead. He felt in the presence of a multitude. He had once felt thus when seeing a single redskin steal like a shadow round the camp, knowing that the night concealed a host of others. About her actual form and body, too, this sense of multitude also spread and trembled, only just concealed. And indescribable utterly. For the edges of the child were ill-defined and misty, so that he could not see exactly where her outline ceased. The candlelight played round and over her as though she filled the room. She might have been all through the air above him, behind as well as opposite, close in front as well. In a sense he felt that she had come to him through the open windows and from the night itself, and not merely along the passage and through the narrow door. She came from the entire place. He made a feverish, struggling effort to concentrate his mind upon common words. He wanted to move backwards, but his feet refused to stir. The familiar sound of her name he uttered close into her face. "Manya, and at this hour of the night," he stammered. His voice was thick and without resonance in his mouth, smothered like a sound in a closed box. And as he heard the name, a kind of silent laughter reached him, inaudible really, as though inside him, sly laughter like her own. For the name had lost its known familiarity. It, too, was different and otherwise, though for the life of him he could not seize at first wherein the alteration lay. She smiled, and her eyes wide opened were like stars. The breath came soft and windily between her lips, but no words with it. It was regular, deep, unhurried. There was something in her face that petrified him, something, as it were, non-human. He began to forget who and where he was. Identity slipped from him like a dream. With another effort, this time a more violent one, he strove to fasten upon things that were close and real in life. He felt the buttons down his coat, fingering them desperately till they hurt his hands and escaped from his slippery, moist skin. "Manya!" he repeated in a louder voice while his mind plunged out to seek the child he had always known behind the familiar name. And this time she answered. But to his horror, the whole room, and even space beyond the actual room, seemed to answer with her. The name was repeated by her lips, yet came from the night beyond the open window, too. He had made a question of it. The answer, repeating it, was assent. "Manya!" he heard all round him, while the head bent gently down and forward. The shock of it restored to him some power of movement, and he stumbled back a step or two further from her side. It might well have been whimsical and cheap, this artificial play upon a name, but instead of either it was abominably significant. This motionless figure, so close that he could feel her breath upon his face, was positively in some astonishing way more than one. She was many. The laughter that lay behind the trivial little thing was a laughter both grand and terrible. It was the laughter of the sea, of the woods, of sand, a host that no man counteth, the laughter of a multitude. And he thrust out both his hands automatically lest she should touch him. He shook from head to toe. Contact with her person would break up his being into millions. The sensation of terror was both immense and acute, sweeping him beyond himself. Like her, he was becoming many, becoming hundreds and thousands, sand that none can number. "Child," he heard his voice repeating faintly, yet with an emphasis that spaced the words apart with slow distinctness. "What does this mean?" In vain he tried to smother the beseeching tone in it that was like a cry for help. He stepped back another pace. She did not move. Composure then began to come back slowly to him a little and a little. He remembered who he was and where he was. He said to himself the commonplace thing. "This is Manya, my little niece, and she ought to be asleep in bed." It sounded ridiculous even in his mind, but he tried deliberately to think of ordinary things. And then he said it aloud. "Do you realize where you are and what you are doing, child?" And then he added, gaining courage, a question of authority. "Do you realize what time it is?" Her answer came again without hesitation, as from a long way off. A smile lit up the entire face, gleaming from her skin like moonlight. There were tears, he saw, upon the cheeks, but the face itself was radiant, wonderful. "The time," she said, peering very softly into his eyes, "is now." And she took a slow gliding step towards him, with a movement that frightened him beyond belief. But by this time he had himself better in hand. He understood that the child was walking in her sleep. It was her little frame that was being worked and driven by another. She was possessed. Something was speaking through the entranced physical body. Her answer regarding time was the answer absolute, not relative, the only true answer that could be given. Other answers would be similar. He understood that here was the long-expected revelation, and that he must question her if he wished to hear it. He resolved to do so, but with a cold awe in his heart as though he were about to question death. They both retained their first positions 3 feet apart, standing. The candle behind him on the table shed its flickering light across her altered features. Outside he heard the trees shaking and tossing in the gusts of rainy wind. "Who are you, then?" he asked hesitatingly in a low tone. There was no reply, but effort showing that she heard and tried to answer traced a little frown above the eyebrows, and the eyes looked puzzled for a moment. "You mean," he whispered, "you cannot tell me?" The head bowed slowly once by way of assent. "You cannot find the word, the language," he helped her. "Is that it?" He still whispered, afraid of his own voice. "Yes," was the answer, spoken below the breath. Then instantly afterwards, straightening herself up with a vigorous movement that startled him horribly, she made a curious rushing gesture of the whole body, spreading her arms out through the air about her. "I am like that!" The voice sprang out loud and clear. She seemed by the gesture to gather space in the night into her wide embrace. She repeated it. The face smiled marvelously. Through this slim body, he realized, there rolled something ancient as the stars. It poured through space against him like a sea. It turned his little ideas of space all otherwise. "Tell me where you come from," he asked quickly, eager yet dreading to hear. "From everywhere," came the answer like a wind. He paused, breathless with astonishment. He felt himself dwindling. Here was a vaster thing than he had contemplated. It was surely no single discarnate influence that possessed the child. "And for whom?" It was whispered as before. The figure stepped with a single gliding stride towards him, coming so close that he held his ground only by tremendous effort of the will. "For you!" The voice came like a clap of wind again, at once soft yet thundering, filling the entire room. "For me," he faltered. "Your message is for me." He felt the assault of strange, violent sensations he had never known before and could not name. A boyhood's dream rushed back upon him for an instant. He recalled his misery and awe when he stood before the judgment throne for some unforgivable breach of trust which he could not explain because the dream concealed its nature. Only this was 10 times greater, and his guilt beyond redemption. "And I," he stammered. "Who am I?" Her eyes looked him all over like a stare of the big moon. "You," she answered without pause or hesitation. "You do not know my name?" he insisted, still clinging to the clue that her he spoke with must be from the dead. The little frown came back between the eyes. She nodded darkly. "You," she repeated, giving the answer absolute again, the only really true one. The girl stood like a statue, serene and solemn. She stared through and beyond him, motionless but for a scarcely perceptible swaying, and calm as a meadow in the dawn. Enormous meanings passed from her eyes across the air and sank down into him like meanings from a forest or a sea. From these, he realized, came her stupendous inspiration, and so realizing, he knew at last his deep mistake. For not so do the dead return. They never indeed return, because from the heart that loved them they have never gone away, but only changed their magic intercourse in kind. And had she known, she would have approved the wisdom of his great decision, while clearing his motive of all insincerity at the same time. It was not she who brought the protest and the menace. It was something bigger by far, something awful and untamed. It was the place itself. And behind the place stood nature. It was nature that possessed the child, and used her little lips and hands and body for its thundering message of disapproval. Manya was possessed by nature. And the shock of the discovery first turned him into stone. His body did not stir the fraction of an inch. In that moment of vivid realization, these two little human figures stood facing one another, motionless as columns, and while so standing, the one who brought the message for himself drew closer. For several minutes he saw absolutely nothing. The approach was too big for any sensory perceptions he could recognize, and then mercilessly, pitilessly, the power of sight returned. He knew the touch of a giant earthy hand was upon his arm. Beside him in the flickering candlelight stood nature. He looked into a host of mighty eyes that yet his imagination translated into merely two, eyes set wide apart beneath enormous brows. He met the gaze of the gigantic, the patient, the inexorable that saw him as he was, and judged him where he stood. And a melting ran through his body, as though the bones slipped from their accustomed places, leaving him utterly without support. He swayed but did not fall. His physical frame stood upright to receive like a blow the revelation that was coming. And then with a curious, deep sense of shame, he realized abruptly that his position in regard to her was inappropriate. He, at any rate, had no right to stand. His proper attitude must be a very different one. He took her by the hand and, bending his head with an air of humble worship, led her slowly across the room. The touch of her was wonderful, like touching wind, all over him. With a reverence he guided her, all unresisting, to a high-backed chair beside the open window. She lowered herself upon it and sat upright. She stared fixedly before her into space. No clothing in the world could have stolen from her childish face and figure the nameless air of grandeur that she wore. She was August, and he knelt before her. He raised his folded hands. A moment his eyes rested on the dispassionate little face, then looked beyond her into the night of wind and rain. His gaze, returning, then sought the eyes again. And the child, sweet little human interpreter of so vast a mystery, bent her head downwards and looked into his heart. Wind stirred the hair upon her neck. He saw the bosom gently rise and fall. "What is it that you have to say to me?" he whispered, like a prayer for mercy. "What is the message that you bring?" Her lips moved very slightly. The smile broke out again like moonlight across the lowered face. The words dropped through the sky. Very slowly, very distinctly, they fell into his open heart, simple as wind or rain. "Leave me as I am, and as you found me. Leave us together as we are, and as we were." 14. There came then a sudden blast that swept with a shout across the night, and through his mind passed also a tumult like a roaring wind. Both winds, it seemed to him, were in the room at once. He had the sensation of being lifted from the earth. The candle was extinguished, and then the sound and terror dipped away again into silence and into distance whence it came. He found himself standing stiffly upright, though he had no recollection of rising from his knees. With an abruptness utterly disconcerting, he was himself again. No item of memory had faded. He remembered the entire series of events, only he was in possession of his normal mind and powers. Fear, awe, and wonder all departed. Manya, who had been walking in her sleep, was sitting close before him in the darkness. He could just distinguish her outline against the open window. But he was master of himself again. Even the wild improbability, the extravagance of his own actions, the very lunacy of the picture that the night now smothered, left him unbewildered. And the calmness that thus followed the complete transition proved to him that all he had witnessed, all that had happened, had been true. In no single detail was there falseness or distortion due to the excitement of a hysterical mood. It had been right and inevitable. He lit the candle again quietly with a hand that did not tremble. He saw Manya sitting on the high-backed chair with her head sunk forward on her breast. Gently he raised the face. The eyes were now closed, and the regular deep breathing showed that the girl was sound asleep, but with the normal sleep of tired childhood. The immensity to which he had knelt and prayed in her was gone, gone from the room, gone out into the open darkness of the place. It had visited her, it had used her, it had left her. But at the same time he understood, as by some infallible intuition, that the warning to depart she brought him was not yet complete. It had reached his mind, but not as yet his soul. In its fullness, the notice to quit could not be delivered between close, narrow walls. Its delivery must be outside. He looked at the sleeping child in silence for several minutes. She sat there in a semi-collapsed position, and in momentary danger of falling from her chair. The lips were parted, the eyes tight shut, the red tam-o'-shanter dropping over one side of the face. Both hands were folded in her lap. By the light of 2 candles now he watched her, while the perspiration he had not been as yet aware of dried upon his skin, and made him shiver with the cold. And after long hesitation he woke her. With difficulty the girl came to, stared up into his face with a blank expression, rubbed her eyes, and then, with returning consciousness of who and where she was, looked mightily astonished. "Manya, child," he began gently, "don't be frightened."
"I'm not," she said at once. "But where am I? Is that you, Uncle?"
"Been walking in your sleep. It's all right. Nothing's happened. Come, I'll see you back to bed again." And he made a gesture as though to take her hand, but she avoided him. Still looking bewildered and perplexed, she said,
"Oh, I remember now. I wanted to go out and see things. I want to go out still."
Then she added quickly as the thought struck her,
"But does Fraulein know? You haven't told Fraulein, Uncle, have you? I mean, you won't?"
He shook his head. This was no time for chiding.
I often go out like this, at night, when you're all asleep. It's the only time now since—"
He stopped her instantly at that.
"You fell asleep while dreaming. Was that it?"
He tried to laugh a little, but the laughter would not come.
"I suppose so."
She glanced down at her extraordinary garments, but no smile came to the eyes or lips. Then she looked round her and gazed for a minute through the open window. The rain had ceased. The wind had died away. Moist, fragrant air stole in with many perfumes.
"I don't remember quite. I was in bed. I'd been asleep already, I think. Then something woke me."
She paused.
"There was something crying in the night."
"Something crying in the night," he repeated quickly, half to himself. She nodded.
"Crying for me,"
she explained in a tone that sent a shudder all through him before he could prevent it.
"So I thought I'd go out and see. Uncle, I had to go out,"
she added earnestly, still whispering.
"Because they were crying. To get at you. Unless I brought them. Unless they came through me."
She stopped abruptly. Her eyes grew moist. She was on the verge of tears.
"It would have been so terrible for you. I mean—"
He stiffened as he heard it. He made a violent effort at control, stopping her further explanation. "And you weren't afraid to go out like this into the dark?" he asked, more to cover retreat than because he wanted to hear the reply.
"I put myself out for you," she answered simply. "I let them come in. That way you couldn't get hurt. And me they had to come gently. They were an army. Only nothing out of me could hurt you, Uncle."
She suddenly put her arms about his neck and kissed him.
"Oh, Uncle Dick, it was lucky I was there and ready, wasn't it?"
And Elliot, remembering that great disturbance in the woods, pressed the child tenderly to himself, praying that she might not understand his heart too well, nor feel the cold that made his entire body tremble like a leaf. He had thought of an angry animal presence lurking in the darkness. It had been bigger than that, and 1,000 times more dangerous.
"You see,"
she added with a little gasp for breath when he released her,
"they waked me on purpose. I dressed at an awful rate. I got to the door. I remember that perfectly well. And then—"
An expression of bewilderment came into her face again. "Yes," he helped her. "And then what?"
"Well, I forget exactly. But something stopped me. Something came all round me and took me in their arms. It was like arms of wind. I was lifted up and carried in the air. And after that I forget the rest. Forget everything, till now."
She stopped. She took off her tam o' shanter and smoothed her untidy hair back from her forehead. And as he looked a moment at her, this little human organism still vibrating with the passage of a universal power that had obsessed her, making her far more than merely child, yet still leaving in her the sweetness of her simple love, he came to a sudden, bold decision. He would face the thing complete. He would go outside. "Manya," he whispered, looking hard at her, "would you like to go out, now, with me? Come, child. Suppose we go together." She stared at him, then darted about the room with little springs of excitement. She clapped her hands softly, her eyes alight and shining.
"Uncle Dick, you really mean it? Wouldn't it be grand?"
"Of course I mean it. See, I'm dressed and ready." And he pointed to his boots and clothes.
"It's the very best thing we can do, really,"
she said, trying to speak gravely, but the mischievous element uppermost at the idea of the secret nocturnal journey.
"They'll see that you're not afraid, and you'll be safe then forever and ever and ever. Hooray!"
She twirled the tam o' shanter in the air above her head, skipping in her childish joy.
"And we'll go past Fräulein's door,"
she insisted mischievously, as he took her outstretched hand and led the way on tiptoe down the dark front stairs. "Hush," he whispered gruffly. "Don't talk so loud." She fastened up her garments, and they moved like shadows through the sleeping house. 15. That journey he made with this child of nature among the dripping trees and along soaked paths was one that Elliot never forgot. For him its meaning was unmistakable. His early life again supplied a parallel. He had once seen a wretched man marched out of camp with 2 days' rations to shift for himself in the wilderness as best he might. A prisoner convicted of treachery, but whose life was spared on the chance that he might redeem it, or die in the attempt. He had seen it done by redskins. He had seen it done by white. And hanging had been better. Yet the crime, stealing a horse or sneaking another's grub stakes, was one that civilization punishes with a paltry fine, or condones daily as permissible business acumen. In primitive conditions, it was a crime against the higher law. It was sinning against nature, and nature never is deceived. Richard Elliot was now being drummed out of camp, and the child who led him, mischief in her eyes and the joy of forbidding pleasure in her heart, was all unconscious of the awful role she played. Yet it was she who as well had pleaded for his life and saved him. Nature turned him out. The place rejected him, and Manya saw him safely to the confines of that wilderness of houses, ugliness, commercial desolation, where he must wander till he remade his soul or lost it altogether. They cautiously opened the front door, and the damp air rushed to meet them. "Hush," he repeated, closing it carefully behind him. But the child was already upon the lawn. Beyond her, dark blots against the sky, rose the massed outline of the little pointed hills. There were no stars anywhere, though the clouds were breaking into thinning troops, but it was not too dark to see, for a moon watched them somewhere from her place of hiding. The air was warm and very sweet, left breathing by the storm. "Hush, Manya," he whispered again, ill at ease to see her go. She ran back, her feet inaudible upon the thick wet lawn, and took his hand.
"We'll go by the piney valley,"
she said, assuming leadership, and he made no objection, though this was the direction of the sample pits. It led also, he remembered, to the mill, the spot where she who had left him in charge had gone upon her long, long journey. They went forward side by side. The wind below them hummed gently in the treetops, but it did not reach their faces. The whole wet world lay breathing softly about them, exhausted by the tempest. It was very still. It watched them pass. There was no effort to detain them, and in Dick Elliot's heart was a pain that searched him like a pain of death itself. But his companion, he now clearly realized, was merely the child again, eerie, wonderful, eldritch, but still the little Manya that he knew so well. Mischief was in her heart and the excitement of unlawful adventure in her blood, but nothing more. The vast obsessing entity that had constituted her judge and executioner was now entirely gone. He was spared the added shame of knowing that she realized what she did. Sometimes she left his side, to come back presently with a little rush of pleasurable alarm. He was uncertain whether he liked best her going from him, or her sudden return. Their tread was now muffled by the needles as they went slowly down the pathways of the piney valley. The occasional snapping of small twigs alone betrayed their movements. Heavy branches, soaked like sponges, splashed showers on the ground when their shoulders brushed them in the passing, and drops fell of their own weight with mysterious little thuds, like footsteps everywhere about them in the woods. Manya dived away from his side. She came back sometimes in front of him and sometimes behind. He never quite knew where she was. His mind indeed neglected her, for his thoughts were concentrated within himself. Her movements were the movements of a block of shadow, shifting here and there like shadows of trees and clouds in faint moonlight.
"Uncle, tell me one thing,"
he heard with a start as she suddenly stood in front of him across the narrow pathway, and so close that he nearly bumped against her.
"Isn't there something here that's angry with you? Something you've done wrong to?"
"Hush, child. Don't say such things." He felt the shiver run through him. He pushed her forward with his hands.
"But they're being said all round us. Uncle, don't you hear them?"
she insisted. "I've always loved the place. We've always been happy here together." He whispered it, as though a terror was in him lest it should be overheard and contradicted. Her answer flabbergasted him. Her intuitions were so uncannily direct and piercing.
"That's what I meant. You've been unkind. You've hurt it."
"Manya," he repeated severely, "you must not say such things, and you must not think them."
"I'm so awfully sorry, Uncle Dick,"
she said softly in the dark, and promptly kissed him. The kiss went like a stab into his heart. Then she was gone again, and he caught her light footsteps several yards in front as though a shower of drops had fallen on the needles.
"Uncle,"
came her voice again close beside him. She stood on tiptoe and pulled his ear down to the level of her lips.
"Hold my hand tight. We're coming near now."
She was curiously excited. To the mill? He asked, knowing quite well she meant another thing.
No, to the pits the men dug,
she answered, nestling in against him while his own voice echoed faintly. Yes, the sample pits. He felt like passing the hostile outposts of the camp, who would shoot him but for the presence of the appointed escort. A sigh of lonely wind went past them with its shower of drops, and these little hands of wind with their fingers of sweet rain helped forward his expulsion. The empty wilderness beyond lay waiting for his soul. It heard him coming. And a curious deep revelation of the child's state of mind then rushed suddenly upon him. He knew that she expected something, and her answer to the question he put explained his own thought to himself. What is it you expect, Manya? He had asked unwisely.
Not expect exactly, uncle, for that would be the wrong way. But I know.
And several kinds of fear shot through him as he heard it, for the words lifted a veil and let him see into her mind a moment. She had said another of her profoundly mystical truths. Expectation, anticipation, he divined, would provide a mold for what was coming, would give it shape, but yet not quite its natural shape. To anticipate keenly meant to attract too quickly, to force. The expectant desire would coax what was coming into an unnatural form that might be dreadful because not quite true. Let the thing approach in its own way, uninvited by imaginative dread. Let it come upon them as it would, deciding its own shape of arrival. To expect was to invite distortion. This flashed across him behind her simple words. You fearful child, he whispered, forcing an unnatural little laugh.
The soft, wet, sticky things, half yellow and half white, she began, resenting his laughter, always moving and never looking twice the same.
Then before he could stop her, she stopped of her own accord. She clutched his arm. He understood that it was the closeness of the thing that had inspired the atrocious words. She held his arm so tightly that it hurt. They stood in the presence of others than themselves. Yet these others had not come to them. The movement of approach was not really movement at all. It was a condition in himself had altered so that he knew. Out here the veil had thinned a little, as it had thinned in the room an hour ago. And he saw space otherwise. This power that in humanity lies normally inarticulate was breaking through. In the room its language had been a stammer. It was a stammer now, or in the terms of sight it was a little fragment utterly inexplicable by itself, since the entire universe is necessary for its complete expression. Yet Elliot did perceive the enormous thing behind, the thing to which he had been unfaithful by prostituting his first original love. And the fact that it was interwoven with his ordinary little human feelings at the same time only added to the bewilderment of its stupendous reality. He saw for a fleeting moment just as Manya saw, from her immediate point of view.
It's here,
she whispered, in a voice that sounded most oddly everywhere.
It's here, the angry thing you've hurt.
On either side of the path where the heatherland came close, he saw the openings the men had dug, pale, luminous patches of whitish yellow. Between the bushy tufts, they shone faintly gleaming against the night. Perspective in that instant became the merest trick of sight, a trivial mental jugglery. That slope of coal-black moor actually was extraordinarily near. The treetops were just as well beneath his feet, where he stood among their roots. Either was true. There was neither up nor down. The sky was in his hands, a little thing, where the stars and moon hid, washed within the current of his blood. Size was illusion, as relative as time. No object itself had any size at all. He saw her universe, all true as ever, but from another point of view, and the entire place ran down here to a concentrated point. The sample pits pressed close against his face. "The pits," she whispered, with the sound of wind and water in her breath. So for a moment he saw from the point of view whence Manya always saw. He and the child and the spirit of the place stood side by side on that narrow shelf of darkness, sharing a joint in absolute comprehension. Her elemental aspect became his own, for his inner eye was against the peephole through which her behind the scenes was visible. He realized a new thing. grand as a field of stars. For the place here focused almost into sentiency. Those slow-moving forces that stir to growth in crystals, waken and breathe in plants, and first in the animal world know consciousness. Here moved vast and inchoate, through the structure of the dream estate he owned, yet moved not blind and inarticulate, for the stress of some impulse, normally undivined by men, urged them toward articulate expression. Here was reaction approximate to those reactions of the nervous cells which in their ultimate result men call emotions, and this irresistible correspondence between the two appalled him. The raw material of definite sensation here poured loose and terrible about him from the ground. In them, moreover, was anger, protest, warning, and a menacing resentment, all directed against his mean, insignificant being. From these sample pits issued the menace and the warning, just as literally as there issued from them also the soft white clay that would degrade the immemorial beauty he had once thought he loved with a clean, pure love. The pits were wounds. They drew all the feelings of the injured place into the tenderness of sentient organs. But behind the threatening anger he recognized a softer passion, too. There was a sadness, a deep yearning, and a searching melancholy as well that seemed to bear witness to his rejection, with a sighing as of the sea and wood and hills. And here doubtless came in the interweaving of his own little human emotions, for an overpowering sorrow soaked his heart and mind. The judgment that found him wanting woke all his stores of infinite regret. It would have been better for him had he found that millstone which can save the soul, because it removes temptation. "It is too late," breathed round him in 3 weeping voices that passed out between his lips as a single cry together. "It is too late." Yet nothing happened. That is, he saw nothing. Nothing translatable by any words that he could find. Time dwindled and expanded curiously. The past ran on before him, and the future grouped itself behind his back. The seconds and minutes which men tick off from the apparent movement of the sun gave place to some condition within himself where they lay gathered forever into the circle of the present. He remembers no actual sequence of acts or movements. Duration drew its horns back into a single point. It is sure, however, that these 2 human beings marched presently on. They steadily became disentangled from the spot, and somehow or other moved away from the staring pits. For Elliot, looking back, recalls that it felt like walking past the mouths of loaded cannon. Also that the pits watched them out of sight as portraits follow a moving figure with their expressionless stare. He thinks that he looked straight before him as he went. He is sure no single word was spoken, until they left the trees behind and emerged into the open. The mill, the old familiar building, was the thing that first restored him to a normal world again. He saw its outline, humped and black, shouldering its way against the sky. He heard the water running under the wheel, but even the mill, like a hooded figure, turned its face away. It expressed the melancholy of a multitude, and the woods were everywhere full of tears. Manya, he realized then beside him, was making the humming sound of the water that flowed beneath that motionless wheel. Her voice became the voice of the place, the undifferentiated sound of nature. It was the voice of dismissal and farewell. Here was the gateway through which his soul passed out into the wilderness. He involuntarily stooped down to feel her, and she lifted her face up in the darkness and kissed him. But it was across a barrier that she kissed him. He already stood outside. And half an hour later they were indoors again, and the house was still. Manya slept as soundly as the placid Fräulein Bjölke, or the motherly Mrs. Couve doubtless also slept. But he lay battling with strange thoughts for hours. Night and the wind were oddly mingled with them. Water, hills, and masses of strong landscape, too. They rose before his mind's eye in a giant panorama, endlessly moving past beneath huge skies, and visible against a pale background of luminous yellowish white. It had strange movements of its own, this yellowish background, like the swaying of a curtain on the stage, and sometimes it surged forwards with a smothering sweep that enveloped everything of beauty he had ever known. It then obliterated the world. Stars were extinguished. Scenery turned to soil. The specter of the clay he had invoked possessed the place. He lay there frightened in his sleepless bed and saw the dawn, a helpless little mortal, destroyed by his faithlessness and breach of trust. And all night long there lay outside, yet watching him, something else that equally never slept. Agile, alert, unconquerable. Only it was no longer disturbed, for its purpose was accomplished. It had turned him out. And it is not necessary to tell how John Casanova Murdoch soon thereafter took the work in hand and developed the place, as he expressed it, without a hitch. For John C. had made no promises of love, nor had he pretended to establish with nature that intimate relationship of trust and worship which invokes the spiritual laws. Nature took no note of him, for he worked frankly with her, and his motive, if not exalted, was at least a pure one. And the clay, as he phrased it a little later in his expressive Western lingo, soon was paying hand over fist. The money was pouring in, more money than you could shake a stick at.